Silas Vane's voice cut through the frozen air like an axe splitting green wood. $20, he called out, and he was grinning when he said it, not the grin of a man making a bid, but the grin of a man who already knew the outcome and found the whole business amusing. He stood at the edge of the crowd with his thumbs hooked into his belt, his boots planted wide in the snow, and he looked at Evelyn Hart the way a farmer looks at a lame horse. He's deciding whether to buy cheap or just put down. $20 for the widow. Debt's 34. Town gets the difference. Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps in January cold without shoes. The boards beneath her feet had ice in the grain of the wood. She was 26 years old, and she was being sold. If that had happened to you, if you had been standing there, barefoot in the snow, while a crowd of people you had known your whole life watched a man price you like furniture, what would you have done? Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel and follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will shake you to your core. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The winter that buried Jasper Hollow in 1889 was not the worst in living memory, but it was close enough that the old-timers stopped arguing about which one was worse and just agreed that this one was bad. Snow had been falling since the second week of November, not in storms exactly, but in that relentless quiet way that accumulates without drama, and then one morning you open the door, and the drifts are chest-high, and the world outside looks like it's been erased. The mountains above town were invisible most days, lost in low gray cloud. The creek had frozen hard enough that children were walking across it, and the sound of the wind through the gaps in the older buildings was something between a whistle and a moan that you stopped hearing after a while, the way you stop hearing a clock tick. Evelyn Hart had been a widow for 11 days when the bank sent the notice. She read it at the kitchen table with her coat still on, because the fire had burned down to ash in the night, and she hadn't had the will to rebuild it yet. Thomas had always done the fire in the mornings. That had been their arrangement without either of them ever talking about it. He built the fire, she made the coffee, and by the time she came downstairs the room was warm, and the kettle was already starting to sing. 11 mornings without that, and she still came downstairs expecting it. The notice was 3 paragraphs. She read them twice, then sat with the paper in her hands and looked at the wall. Thomas had borrowed against the house. She hadn't known. He hadn't told her, which she supposed was a thing she should have questions about. But Thomas was dead, and questions directed at dead men have a way of not going anywhere useful. So she folded the paper and set it flat on the table and tried to think. The house was not worth enough to cover the debt. The bank's arithmetic was clear on that point. Thomas had borrowed $34 more than the property value. The bank wanted its money. The town of Jasper Hollow, through its county charter, had a mechanism for exactly this situation: debts owed by estates without sufficient assets. And that mechanism had a name that nobody said out loud in polite company, but that everyone knew. A settlement auction. She had 3 days. Evelyn was not a small woman, and she had never been. Even as a girl, she had been built on a larger scale than the other girls in town. Broader shoulders, heavier through the middle, feet that required shoes ordered special from the catalog because the general store never stocked her size. She had made a kind of peace with it over the years, the particular peace of someone who has been fighting a losing battle long enough to stop pretending it's going to turn around. She knew what people said. She knew the looks. She had developed the skill, common among women in her situation, of appearing not to notice things she noticed completely. Thomas had married her anyway, which had surprised people more than it surprised her. He was not a handsome man, and not a prosperous one, a mill hand with a moderate income and a tendency toward optimism that outpaced his circumstances. And Evelyn had understood that their marriage was a transaction of sorts, the way most marriages in Jasper Hollow were, 2 people recognizing that they could make a better arrangement together than apart. She had not been in love with him, exactly, but she had been fond of him, and fond is more than some people get, and she knew that. She spent the 3 days before the auction trying to find another way. She went to the bank first, to a man named Aldrich who had small hands and a habit of tapping his desk with 2 fingers while he talked, as if keeping time to music only he could hear. She explained her situation. She asked about an extension. He tapped the desk. He said the bank understood her position, but that the charter was very clear, and the county had certain obligations, and he was sure she could see that his hands were tied. His hands were not tied. They were folded neatly on the desk, looking entirely untied. She went to the general store and spoke to the owner about possible work. He said he was sorry, but he didn't have anything. He said it while looking at a point somewhere past her left ear. She went to the Hendersons, who owned the largest spread on the south side of town, and sometimes hired extra help in winter, and Mrs. Henderson came to the door and looked at Evelyn with an expression that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and dismissive, which is a difficult expression to hold, and Mrs. Henderson had clearly been practicing it for years. She said she would ask her husband. She didn't ask her husband. The minister's wife brought a pie. Evelyn ate half of it and then stopped, because she knew she had always known that a woman in her position could not afford to be seen as the kind of person who ate half a pie in one sitting, even in private, even in grief. She wrapped the rest and set it on the counter and did not think about it. By the third morning she had found nothing, no work, no loan, no arrangement. The bank's mechanism would proceed. She didn't own proper winter boots. Her boots had worn through at the sole in November, and she had been managing with wrapped cloth inside them, which kept some of the cold out. But sometime in the night before the auction the wrapping had slipped loose, and when she got to the courthouse steps, the board under her right foot was bare, and then the board under her left foot, and she told herself it was fine. It wasn't that cold. She would get through this, and then figure out the next thing. There were perhaps 40 people in the crowd. Jasper Hollow had a population of around 200, so 40 was not everyone, but it was enough. She recognized most of them. She had grown up here, gone to school here, spent her entire life in this valley. She saw the Hendersons near the back. She saw the bank clerk Aldrich standing off to one side with his hands folded, which seemed appropriate. She saw women she had been girls with standing in clusters, murmuring to each other. The county man who ran the auction was named Devers, and he was efficient about it in the way that people who do unpleasant jobs become efficient, not cruel exactly, but stripped of any ceremony that might make the thing take longer than necessary. He read the charter provision. He read Thomas's debt. He described the terms. The winning bid would clear the debt. Any surplus would go to the estate. And the winner would have Devers use the word claim here. And Evelyn noticed he didn't look at her when he said it. The winner would have claim on the services of the indebted party for a period of up to 1 year, or until the debt was otherwise satisfied. Services. Claim. The words that meant what they meant without saying what they meant. The cold came up through the boards into Evelyn's feet, and she stood straight and looked at the middle distance and kept her face even. If she was going to fall apart, it was not going to be here. Not on these steps. Not in front of these people. Silas Vane spoke before Devers had even finished. $20, he said, and the grin was already on his face. That comfortable, settled grin of a man who considers himself the natural conclusion of any situation. Evelyn knew Silas Vane the way you know whether not personally exactly, but by its effects. He ran the biggest lumber operation in the county, had fingers in the mill, the freight contracts, 2 of the town's 4 supply agreements, and reportedly a considerable amount of the county commissioner's patience. He was not old, early 40s, still physically imposing, and he had the confidence of a man who had never been seriously inconvenienced. She had spoken maybe a dozen words to him in her life. She had always had the feeling, on the few occasions their paths crossed, that he was filing her away somewhere, the way a man inventories things he might want to use eventually. $20. On $34 of debt, he wasn't trying to win clean, he was trying to win cheap, because the difference between winning at 20 and winning at 34 was just money, but the difference between being bought for $20 and being bought for $34 was something else. And Silas Vane understood that distinction perfectly. Someone in the crowd said 15, but that was nerves. Talking the bid went away quickly, swallowed back by whoever offered it. A man named Grady tried 22, then seemed to remember something pressing elsewhere and went quiet. Silas said 25, and looked around the crowd with that settled expression. And there was a particular silence that fell the silence of a room, deciding that this is just how it's going to go. Evelyn's feet were past cold now. They had moved through cold into something else. A kind of deep ache that wasn't painful exactly, more like a sound you could feel in the bone. She thought, I need to not be here. I need to be somewhere that is not these steps. She thought, I do not know where that is. She thought, figure it out later. Right now, just stand straight. The voice that broke the silence came from the back of the crowd, and it wasn't loud. That was the first thing she noticed about it. It didn't need to be loud. It had the particular quality of a voice that knows it doesn't need volume to be heard. $50. The crowd turned. Evelyn turned. She didn't know him. She was certain of that immediately. This was not a man she had seen before, and Jasper Hollow was small enough that she would have remembered. He was tall, built on a lean but solid frame, somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a coat that was expensive in a way that was almost invisible, not showy, just correct. The kind of quality that comes from actually being able to afford it, rather than trying to look like you can. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked at Devers when he said it, not at Silas Vane, which Evelyn noticed. Devers looked at him. I'm sorry, sir, I don't. Colton Rourke, the man said. I have a ranch up on the Clearwater Fork. I've been in town for supplies. I'll pay $50. Silas had stopped grinning. That was the second thing Evelyn noticed. The debt is 34, Devers said, because he was a man who felt information was useful. I know what the debt is, Colton Rourke said. $50. Silas turned to look at him fully then, taking his measure in the way men do when they encounter an obstacle they hadn't expected. Whatever he saw in Colton Rourke's face didn't seem to reassure him. He said, 60. And his voice had changed. There was an edge in it now that hadn't been there before. Colton looked at him for the first time. You don't want to do that, he said. It wasn't a threat. It was delivered entirely without heat, which made it land harder than a threat would have. 70, Silas said. Colton looked back at Devers. $100, he said. Cash right now. And I'd like this concluded. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. That one had been the silence of a decision being made. This one was the silence of a decision being unmade, and nobody in the crowd was sure what to do with it. Silas stared at the back of the crowd for a long moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, and he reset his expression into something almost neutral, and he turned away from Colton Rourke with the careful deliberateness of a man filing something away for later. Devers cleared his throat. Sold, he said, and seemed relieved to say it and be done. Evelyn didn't move immediately. She stood on the steps while the crowd began to break apart, in the way crowds do when the main event is concluded, in clusters and murmurs, people drifting toward each other with things to say, glances thrown back at her from angles people thought she wouldn't catch. She caught all of them. She watched Colton Rourke make his way through the thinning crowd toward Devers, and she watched Optim produce a small leather wallet and count out bills that were clean and unfolded, which meant he had prepared them, which meant this was not entirely impulsive. That observation settled in her chest with a particular weight. She was not sure yet whether it was reassuring or alarming. He spoke to Devers for a moment. Devers wrote something. Colton signed it. Then he turned and walked toward her, and she made herself stand still and hold his gaze, because she was not going to look away. Not here. Not after everything that had already happened on these steps today. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her feet. How long have you been standing on bare boards? He said. A while, she said. He didn't say anything to that. He took off his coat, the good one, the expensive one, and held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment, then at him. I don't need. I know, he said. Take it anyway. She took it. It was warm from his body and heavier than she expected, lined with something that wasn't just wool. She put it around her shoulders, and the difference was immediate and physical, like stepping out of a wind. My horse is around back, he said. There's a wagon on the other side of the livery. When you're ready. I haven't agreed to go anywhere, she said. He looked at her. His eyes were dark, somewhere between brown and something else, and his expression was she was trying to read it and finding it harder than she expected. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. Careful, maybe. The face of a man who is thinking several things at once and not in a hurry to say them. No, he said, you haven't. He put his hands back in his vest pockets. He was in shirt sleeves now, in January, and either he wasn't cold or he was very good at not showing it. I paid off your debt. What you do next is your decision. But I've got a ranch 2 hours north and a warm house, and I'm headed there now. If you want to come, you can. If you don't, the coat's yours either way. She stared at him. Either way, she said. I didn't buy you, he said. I bought a debt. The debt's cleared. She didn't know what to say to that. In all her thinking through these past 3 days, in all the scenarios she had run in her head, the outcomes she had tried to prepare for this was not one she had considered, because it didn't fit into any category she had available. Why, she said, not a question exactly, more like a placeholder while she caught up. He considered it. Because Silas Vane shouldn't have things he wants, he said finally. And because you were standing on bare boards in January, he paused. And because it seemed like the right thing. He said the last part without any particular emphasis, as if it were the least of the 3 reasons rather than possibly the most. Evelyn looked out at the square where the last of the crowd was dispersing. She saw Aldrich heading toward the bank. She saw the Henderson woman talking to someone she didn't recognize. She saw Silas Vane, standing at the far edge of the square near his horse, not gone yet, watching the courthouse steps with an expression she couldn't read from this distance, but that she felt across the cold air like a draft from an open window. She looked back at Colton Rourke. I'll need to get my things, she said. I'll wait, he said. Her things didn't take long. The house had been picked over by the bank's representative the previous day. Nothing of real value remained, and the real value had never been much. She had a cloth bag with a change of clothes, a wool blanket that had been her mother's, a small sewing kit, and a book she had been meaning to finish for 3 years. She put on her extra stockings and wrapped her feet more carefully inside her ruined boots, tying the cloth tight at the ankle, and she did not let herself look around the house more than once. Looking more than once meant something she couldn't afford to mean right now. The cold hit her again the moment she stepped outside, but less brutally than before. Colton's coat was doing its work, and she had taken 2 slices of cold bread from the kitchen before she left, eating one on the steps and folding the other into the coat pocket because she had learned in the past 11 days that the state of her stomach had a direct effect on the state of her composure, and she needed all the composure she could get. Colton was where he said he'd be, around the side of the livery, hitching a second horse to a wagon that had supplies loaded in the bed feed sacks boxes, a roll of wire fencing. He was doing the work himself, which she noticed. He didn't have a hand with him. Either he didn't need one, or he didn't feel like one was necessary for this trip, and she couldn't yet tell which. He saw her coming and said nothing, which she appreciated. He finished the hitch, checked it once, then climbed up to the wagon seat and waited. She climbed up on the other side. It was harder than she wanted it to be. The wagon seat was high and the step was iced and her feet were not at full capacities, and she managed it without asking for help and without falling, which she counted as a small but real victory. They pulled out of Jasper Hollow's Main Street and headed north on the mountain road. Neither of them spoke for the first half-mile. Somewhere around the quarter-mile mark they passed Silas Vane, who was standing at the road's edge, apparently checking something on his horse's shoe. He straightened up when the wagon went by. He looked at Evelyn and not at Colton, and the look was the kind that is designed to be felt rather than seen, the kind that is meant to remind you that this isn't finished. She looked straight ahead and kept her face still. Behind her, not immediately but a few seconds later, she heard Colton say quietly, not to her, almost to himself, "He'll make trouble." "I know," she said. He glanced at her. "You're not surprised?" "No," she said. "Men like Silas Vane don't forget things, especially things that embarrass them." Colton drove for a moment. "Has he bothered you before?" "Not specifically," she said. "But I've known him by type since I was a girl." She paused. "The men who want things they can't just buy, they're patient about it. They wait until circumstances arrange themselves more conveniently." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think clearly." It came out matter of fact, an observation, not a compliment dressed up as one. She couldn't tell yet whether that was better or worse. "I had to learn," she said. The road north climbed steadily, winding up out of the valley floor and into the lower edges of the mountain country. The trees thickened on either side, firs and pines carrying snow on their branches, the weight bending the lower boughs toward the ground. The light was the flat, gray winter light that doesn't seem to come from any particular direction. Colton produced a cloth package from under the seat at some point during the first hour and set it on the bench between them without comment. She looked at it. He kept his eyes on the road. She opened it. Inside was bread, hard cheese, and a piece of smoked meat wrapped in paper. She ate slowly, carefully, and without comment, and after a moment he reached over and took a piece of the cheese and ate it himself, and somehow that made it feel less like charity, which she suspected was the intention. "How long have you been on the Clearwater Fork?" she asked, because silence on a 2-hour wagon ride either becomes comfortable or oppressive, and it was still deciding which. 6 years, he said. "Built the main house the first year. Added the second barn last spring." "You're not from here originally?" "No." She waited to see if he would continue. He didn't, immediately. "Then Wyoming originally?" "Came west looking for," he paused, seemed to decide something, looking for something quieter. She thought about asking what had been loud. She decided not to. There would be time for that conversation or there wouldn't, and pushing at it now felt wrong. "The ranch runs cattle?" she asked. "Cattle, some horses. I breed working horses, ranch horses, the kind that can handle mountain terrain. It's become the main part of the business the last few years." "Is it profitable?" He glanced at her, something shifting briefly in his expression. "Yes," he said, "it is." "Good," she said, and ate another piece of the bread. He drove for another minute, and then something happened to his expression that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it stopped well short of completing itself. "Most people don't ask that directly," he said. "I'm not in a position to be indirect," she said. "I need to know what I'm going into." "Fair enough," he said. "So tell me," she said. "What exactly are you expecting from this arrangement?" "From me." The horse on the right side of the team chose this moment to toss its head and require a slight correction to the reins, and Colton handled that before he answered. When he did, his voice was even. "I need help around the ranch," he said. "I've been managing alone, and I'm not managing it well. There's more work than one person can do well. I've got a cabin that's heated and stocked, and nobody in it. I could use," he seemed to search for the word, "reliable company, someone who can hold up their end. And if I can't," she said, "if the work is more than I can do, we figure it out," he said. She looked at him. "That's not a real answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not, but it's the honest one." He turned to look at her for a moment, long enough to be direct without being rude. "I don't know what you can do yet. I don't think you know either. We'll find out." She turned back to the road. The The trees were denser now, the sky barely visible through the canopy above. "I can cook," she says. "I can sew. I know basic animal care. I grew up with livestock before my family lost the farm." She paused. "I'm not small and I'm not fast, but I'm not fragile either. I've never pretended to be something I'm not. I noticed," he said. She wanted to ask what exactly he had noticed, but the wagon hit a rough patch in the road and the conversation shifted into silence, while they both concentrated on not being thrown sideways, and by the time the road smoothed out again, the moment had passed. The ranch appeared through the trees without warning, first a cleared field, then a fence line, then the shape of a large barn, then the house itself, set back from the tree line with a wide porch that faced south. It was bigger than she had expected. Not extravagant, but solid logs chinked tight, a good chimney, shutters on the windows that were closed against the cold but looked like they worked. A second, smaller structure to the east that might be a storage shed or a bunkhouse. The barn was clearly new on one end, the wood still pale, not yet weathered to gray. She had expected something rougher. She wasn't sure why. Colton pulled the team up near the barn and climbed down, and she climbed down on her own side again, managing it better this time. He began unhitching the horses without ceremony, and she stood for a moment looking at the house. "Fire's banked," he said, nodding toward it. "It'll be cold, but it'll come up fast once you open the flue. There should be wood next to the stove." He paused in the unhitching. "Kitchen's at the back. Bedroom on the north side, yours. I sleep in the loft above the main room." She turned to look at him. He was focused on the harness buckles. "You've thought about this," she said. This wasn't impulsive. He was quiet for a moment, working a stuck buckle loose. "I'd heard about the auction," he said finally. "Came to see it. Wasn't sure what I'd do." He got the buckle free. "Then I saw Silas open his mouth and I knew what I'd do." "You did it for Silas," she said. "Not accusing, just testing the shape of it." "Partly," he said. He looked up from the horse, and partly not. She held his gaze for a moment, then turned toward the house. "I'll get the fire going," she said. "There's stew in the cold box," he said to her back. "From 2 days ago, should still be good." She stopped. Turned. "Cold box, built into the pantry floor, stone line. Food keeps well in winter." She nodded and turned back toward the house. She walked up the porch steps, 3 of them solid, no give, and pushed open the front door. Inside was dark and cold and smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something else she couldn't identify immediately. Something that was just the particular smell of a place that has lived in alone for a long time. She stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. Then she found the stove and the flue handle and the wood box beside it. She opened the flue. She added wood. She found the matches on the shelf above the stove, in exactly the place she would have put them herself. The fire caught. She stood over it for a while, not moving, just feeling the warmth begin to build outward. Outside she could hear Colton moving around the barn, the sounds of horses being stalled and settled, ordinary sounds of a working place being put to rest for the evening. Her feet had stopped aching, or maybe she had just stopped noticing. She put her bag down near the door to the bedroom. She did not open the bedroom door yet. She went to the kitchen and found the pantry, and in the floor of it, the cold box stone-lined as promised, with a latched wooden cover, and inside it the stew in a sealed crock, a piece of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, half a smoked sausage, and 3 eggs sitting in a small basket. She lifted the crock out and set it on the kitchen counter and stood looking at it for a moment. She had left Jasper Hollow barefoot at the bottom of a public auction. She had ridden 2 hours up a mountain with a man she didn't know. She was standing in a kitchen that was not hers, in a house that was not hers, preparing to heat food that was not hers. And yet, the fire in the other room was catching properly now. She could hear it, the particular shift in the sound when wood actually starts to go, rather than just smolder. The kitchen was cold still, but wouldn't be for long. The stew would need maybe 20 minutes on the heat. She got the crock onto the stove and found a wooden spoon and stirred it and put the lid back on. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know whether Colton Rourke was trustworthy or merely better than Silas Vane, which was not a high bar. She didn't know what the work would cost her, or what the winter would cost her, or whether she had traded one kind of trap for another that was just better furnished. She knew she was warm. She knew she had food. She knew she had, for the first time in 11 days, a moment in which nobody was looking at her. She pulled a chair to the stove and sat down and put her ruined boots near the heat. Outside, the sound of Colton finishing in the barn, the sound of the barn door, boots on the porch steps. She was still sitting when he came inside, and he looked at the stew pot, and then at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, and the fire made its ordinary sound between them. It wasn't trust, not yet. It wasn't anything yet that had a name, but it wasn't nothing either. The stew was better than it had any right to be for something 2 days old. Evelyn found that out when Colton came in from the barn, washed his hands at the basin near the door, and sat down across from her at the kitchen table without being invited, because it was his table and his house, and the invitation was already implied. She had set out 2 bowls without thinking about it, which she only noticed after she'd done it. He didn't comment on that. He picked up his spoon and ate. They didn't talk much over the meal. He asked her if the bedroom was all right. She said she hadn't looked yet. He said there were extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. She said thank you. He said the outhouse was around the east side of the house, and there was a lantern on the porch hook for nighttime. She said she'd find it. That was most of dinner. Afterward, he stacked the bowls near the basin and said he'd be up before dawn to start the morning chores, and that she should sleep and not worry about an early start tomorrow. She could figure out the place first. Learn where things were before she took on any real work. He said it plainly, without making it into a larger thing than it was. Then he climbed the ladder to the loft, and that was that. She sat at the table for a while after his lamp went dark up there. Just sat with her hands around the last of the coffee, going cold in the cup, listening to the sounds of the house, settling around her the creak of timber in the wind, the low sound of the fire working itself down, somewhere outside the horses shifting in the barn. It was the quietest night she had remembered in a long time. Jasper Hollow was never entirely quiet. There was always something: the mill, the freight wagons, some argument drifting from the saloon. Up here there was just the mountain and the cold and the wind, and all 3 of them kept to themselves. She went to bed eventually. The bedroom was small, but the bed was solid and the blankets in the chest were wool, good weight, the kind that hold heat properly. She was asleep before she'd finished being surprised by that. The first week was mostly watching and learning. She did not expect it to be easy, and it wasn't. The ranch had a particular rhythm to it that had developed around one person: Colton's rhythms, Colton's systems, the way he moved through a day that had been organized by and for himself. Fitting herself into it was like trying to learn a song by hearing only half the notes at a time. She made mistakes. She looked for things in places they weren't. She misread which gate latch worked which way, and spent 10 minutes in the freezing dark thinking the latch was broken before she figured out you had to lift before you turned. She didn't ask for help any more than she had to, and he didn't offer it any more than was necessary, and somewhere in that mutual restraint they found a working method. The animals were the first thing she got right. She had grown up with livestock. Her father had kept horses and a few cattle on their place before the drought took it, and the knowledge came back to her in the way old physical knowledge does. Not as remembered instruction, but as something in the hands and the body, a sureness about how to move around a large animal without spooking it, how to read the ears, how to check a water trough without making a production of it. Colton's horses were well-bred and intelligent, and had opinions about things which she respected. She learned their names in the first 2 days. By the end of the first week, 2 of them were coming to the fence for her in the mornings, which she noted but did not mention. Colton noticed anyway. He noticed most things she was discovering, though he rarely said so immediately. He absorbed information and sat with it and came back to it later, sometimes days later, in a way that was initially disorienting, and then became simply a thing you knew about him and accounted for. "You've handled horses before," he said one morning, not looking up from the fence post he was resetting. "I told you that," she said. She was holding the post steady while he packed the frozen ground around its base, a job that required 2 people to do well and 1 person to do badly, which was presumably why it had been waiting. "You said you grew up with livestock," he said. "Horses are different from cattle." "My father bred quarter horses," she said before. He packed another layer of dirt in, tamped it with the heel of his boot. "Good horses?" "Good enough that losing them hurt more than losing the farm," she said, and then was briefly surprised at herself for saying it, because she didn't usually talk about that. He didn't respond immediately. Then, what happened to the farm? Drought, then a bad loan. Then a man who explained to my father very patiently why the terms of the loan meant the land was already his. She paused. "My father believed him, and you didn't." "I was 12, she said. "I didn't have a vote." He finished with the post, straightened up, tested the give in it with both hands. Satisfied. He looked at her then, direct, briefly. "I'm sorry," he said, not as a formality. "Just said it." "It was a long time ago," she said. They moved to the next post. The cold in February on the Clearwater Fork was a different creature than the cold in Jasper Hollow. The valley had its own wind patterns, channels through the mountains that funneled air down in ways that made it feel 10 degrees colder than the thermometer suggested. Evelyn learned this the hard way on a morning, when she went out to the water trough without properly layering, and came back inside 20 minutes later, with her fingers gone past numb into something that felt like wooden pegs at the ends of her hands. She sat at the kitchen stove with her hands cupped around a mug of hot water, and her jaw set against the pain of them warming back up, which was worse than the cold had been. And Colton came in from the barn and looked at her hands and said, without inflection, "I'll show you the layering system." "I know how to layer," she said, sharper than she intended. Not for this altitude, he said, equally flat. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, fine. He showed her. It was not a complicated system, but it was specific. The particular order of the layers mattered, and the way the outer gloves overlapped the sleeve cuffs mattered, and which tasks were worth doing barehanded for dexterity, and which absolutely were not. He explained it practically, the same way he explained everything, as if information were a tool, and tools were meant to be functional rather than elegant. She paid attention. She did not have the luxury of pride in this particular moment. After that, she didn't have cold finger trouble again, which was one thing. There were other things. Her feet in those first weeks were an ongoing problem. She needed proper boots, and the ones she had were deteriorating past usefulness. The cloth-wrap makeshift she'd been managing starting to give way in ways she couldn't keep patching. She said nothing about it for almost 2 weeks, managing until one morning Colton came into the kitchen carrying a pair of boots and set them on the table. She looked at them. They were women's boots, well made, wide enough in the last to fit a broader foot, not new but barely used. They were my sister's, he said. She visited last spring, left them when she went back because they were rubbing her wrong. She won't want them back. He paused. Your feet look wider than hers. They might not fit perfect. You have a sister, Evelyn said, because this was the first she had heard of any family at all. I have a sister, he confirmed, as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing to have. She picked up the boots and turned them in her hands. The leather was good. The sole was solid. I'll pay you back, she said. For these and for everything else. I intend to keep account. He was already heading back toward the door. I know you do, he said, and went outside. She sat with the boots in her hands for a moment, feeling the weight of them, and then she put them on. They were slightly tight across the widest part of her foot. He had been right about that. But she laced them loosely, and they held, and the difference was something she felt all the way up into her back, that basic animal relief of being properly footed on cold ground. She went out and did her morning work and didn't favor her feet once. By the end of the first month, she had settled into a version of the days that was hers as much as it was the ranch's. Mornings, water the horses, break ice in the trough if it had crusted overnight, feed the 2 milk cows, collect eggs from the 6 hens that lived in the corner of the smaller barn. Then breakfast, which she had taken over from Colton because his breakfasts were functional to the point of insult salt pork, and a biscuit that was more crust than anything else. She cooked. It was one thing she was confident of and didn't have to learn from scratch, and the kitchen responded to her in the way kitchens do when someone comes in knowing what they're doing. Colton said nothing the first morning she put a proper breakfast on the table: eggs, salt pork done with some care, biscuits that had actual rise to them. He ate everything. The next morning he sat down at the table at the same time, without having to be called. She took that as the comment it was. Afternoons were harder. The physical work of the ranch in winter was relentless, and it was heavy, and she was still building the particular muscles required, not just general strength, but specific strength, the kind that comes from doing the same demanding physical tasks repeatedly until the body adapts. Fence work, hauling feed, stacking wood, clearing snow from the roof of the smaller barn before the weight became a problem, which involved a long-handled scraper and a ladder, and a great deal of balance she wasn't always confident she had. There were things she couldn't do that first month and a half, and she had to reckon with that honestly, because pretending otherwise would have cost more than admitting it. Some of the fence posts she couldn't drive in alone, not enough leverage at her height and weight distribution, though she could hold and pack while Colton drove. Some of the heavy timber work she had to pace differently, resting more than she wanted to, building capacity rather than trying to force it all at once. She learned that winter a practical distinction between what her body couldn't do and what it just hadn't learned yet, and the difference mattered more than she had expected. Colton never made her feel the gap. That was something she kept noticing. He adjusted the work without comment, naturally, the way you'd adjust to any partner's particular strengths and limits, without making it a thing. He wasn't being kind exactly. It was more like he was being efficient, figuring out how 2 people could do the work most effectively, and then just doing it that way. She wasn't sure whether that was better or worse than kindness, but it was easier to receive. The first time she pulled her own weight on something that genuinely needed it, genuinely, without adjustment, without someone compensating, was with the horses. It was the 5th week. Colton came in from the far pasture fence at midday looking more tightly wound than usual, which she was beginning to be able to read in him, a certain set to his jaw, a quietness that was pressured rather than natural. North mare's down, he said. She's been fighting a colic since last night. I've been walking her every 2 hours. She might need surgery, and I don't have the tools for surgery. Evelyn set down what she was doing. Which one? The gray. Dulcie. She knew Dulcie. Dulcie had started coming to the fence for her by the 3rd day. Walk me through what you've done, she said. He did. She listened, then she said, "Has she passed anything in the last 2 hours?" "No. Get me the linseed oil from the pantry. There should be some left from the harness work." He looked at her. "Linseed oil," she said. "My father used it for colic before he called the vet. Sometimes it saved the call." Get it, he got it. She spent the next hour and a half in the barn with Dulcie, working alongside Colton, not instead of him alongside him. Walking the horse, timing the intervals, applying the oil mixed with warm water administered carefully. She talked to Dulcie the whole time. Steadily, not in the baby talk way some people use with animals, but in a low, even voice that was more about continuity of sound than meaning. Dulcie's ears tracked her constantly. The horse passed the blockage about 90 minutes in, not elegantly, but she did. Colton stood in the stall doorway and looked at Dulcie drinking from her bucket with recovered interest, and then he looked at Evelyn and he said, "Where'd you learn that?" "My father," she said. He said a good horseman could diagnose 3 out of 5 colics by watching the ears and the gut sounds. She was brushing Dulcie's neck in long, slow strokes. He was right about most things involving horses, less right about the loan situation. Colton was quiet for a moment. "I would have lost her," he said. "I would have had to go to town for the vet, and she might not have waited." "She might not have," Evelyn agreed. "But she did." He looked at her for another moment, then said, "Thank you," and she could tell it cost him something to say it. Not because he was proud, but because he meant it, and meaning it made it harder. She nodded and went on brushing, and the barn was warm with horse heat, and the smell of hay, and the particular satisfied silence of a problem that had resolved itself in the right direction. That night at dinner he poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one toward her across the table and said, "You should be doing the horse assessments going forward. The buyers come through in spring, you read them better than I do." She looked at the coffee cup. "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." She picked up the cup. "All right," she said. March came in wet and difficult, the snow turning to sleet and back to snow in cycles that made everything harder, the ground alternately ice and mud. The roof drainage backing up twice, the path between the house and the barn becoming a negotiation rather than a walk. Evelyn developed a bad knee in the 3rd week of March, an old weakness from a fall years ago that the repeated cold and damp had woken back up, and for 5 days it swelled and ached and made the stairs difficult and the barn path worse. She wrapped it tightly and kept going, which was the only option available, but she moved slower, which she hated. Colton characteristically noticed without being asked. He rerouted the chores for those 5 days. Without discussion, he didn't announce it. He just did the work that required the most walking, and left her the barn work that involved less ground covered. On the 3rd day, she called him on it. "I can see what you're doing," she said. "Can you?" he said, not looking up from the saddle he was oiling. "You're taking the fence rounds. You took the north pasture this morning." "North pasture needed checking," he said. "It needed checking yesterday, and you let me do it." He set the oil rag down, looked at her. "Your knee is giving you trouble," he said. "It'll cost you more to aggravate it than to ease up for a few days." He picked up the rag again. "This isn't complicated." "I don't need managing," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not managing you. I'm managing the work so the work gets done. It's different." She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, her knee throbbing with a low, steady persistence under the wrap. She wanted to argue with him, and she also knew from a place slightly lower than her pride that he was right. Aggravating the knee now would cost her weeks, not days. She was still building capacity. She couldn't afford to go backward. "Fine," Shia said, and went back inside. On the 5th day, the swelling had receded enough that she returned to full work, and he returned to his half of the chores without comment, and the normal rhythm resumed as if there had been no interruption, which was precisely the right way to handle it, and she knew that even as it irritated her. They were 6 weeks in, maybe 7, when she first went back to Jasper Hollow. It wasn't her idea. Colton had supply items to collect hardware pieces he'd ordered in January that had arrived at the general store, and the wagon needed to go in, and he asked her simply if she wanted to come or stay. She thought about it longer than she wanted to. Then she said she'd come. The road down was easier going than coming up, if the horses knew it, moved with confidence, and the daylight was better in March than it had been in January, a harder, cleaner light that made the mountains look closer. She watched the valley open up below them as they descended the town, appearing in pieces first, the smoke from chimneys, then the shapes of the taller buildings, then the detail of the main street. She had thought she would feel something complicated coming back. She did, but it was quieter than she expected, less like an old wound reopening, and more like touching a scar, something that had changed its nature enough that the original pain was only a reference now, not a presence. The looks started immediately. She had known they would. She had put herself together carefully that morning, not for vanity, which she had never had much use for in the practical sense, but for armor. The clothes Colton had sourced for her over the past weeks, he had found them through some arrangement with a woman in the next county whose build was similar, and he had not made a ceremony of it, fit well enough for work and well enough for town. She wore his hat, the second one he kept hung by the door, because the walk from the wagon to the store was going to be cold. She walked straight, which she had always done. She looked at the street, not at the ground. The first face she recognized was Mrs. Henderson, coming out of the dry goods. The expression that moved across Mrs. Henderson's face was complex surprise, then a reassessment of some kind, then something that was almost resentment, as if Evelyn's improved circumstances were a personal inconvenience. "Evelyn," she said, with the particular precision of a woman who was being careful. "Mrs. Henderson," Evelyn said, and kept walking. She heard the murmuring start behind her. She had also known that would happen. Inside the general store, she collected Colton's parts from the storekeeper, Pruitt, who treated her with a careful neutrality. That was its own kind of message. He knew which way things were arranged now, and he was not going to make problems, but he was also not going to commit to being friendly until he had a clearer sense of how the social weather was going to settle. She paid from the account Colton had told her about, said thank you, and turned to leave. Silas Vane was in the doorway. She hadn't seen him come in. He had the particular talent of appearing in places without seeming to arrive, which she suspected he had cultivated deliberately. He was with one of his lumber foremen, a broad man named Cutter, who stood slightly behind and to the side in the way that said bodyguard more clearly than any announcement could. "Well," Silas said, and his voice had that settled quality again, the comfort of a man who considers all situations to be essentially his. "Widow Hart." He looked at her slowly, up and down, without any attempt to conceal the survey. "Or is it something else now?" "Hard to know what to call you." "My name is Evelyn Hart," she said. "It's been my name the whole time." "That's right," he said, nodding slowly, as if she'd confirmed something. "Just Hart." He let the word sit. "No real change then." She held his gaze. She had been looking at men like Silas Vane her entire life, men who used words the way some people use a boot heel, to put pressure on things until they cracked. The trick, she had learned, was to be the thing that didn't crack. "Excuse me," she said, and moved toward the door. He didn't step aside immediately. He waited the precise amount of time that was still short of physical obstruction, but made the waiting felt 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then he moved. "Say hello to Rourke," he said to her back. She went out into the cold and found Colton at the wagon and handed him the parts and climbed up to the wagon seat and said, "Can we go?" He looked at her face. He looked at the doorway of the store. Then he climbed up and took the reins. They were at the north end of the street, almost out when it happened. She heard Silas's voice from somewhere behind them, pitched to carry, aimed at the group of men gathered near the feed warehouse. "Rourke must be more desperate than I thought. Or his standards have changed considerable since Wyoming." Laughter from the group. Not everyone laughed, but enough. She was looking straight ahead, and she kept looking straight ahead, and she felt her jaw tighten, and her hands close on the rail of the wagon seat, and she thought, Don't give him the turn. Don't give him the look. That's what it's for." The wagon kept moving, and then it stopped. Colton had pulled the reins, and the team was standing still in the middle of the street, and he was climbing down off the wagon seat. And she said, "Don't," but he was already down, and already walking back toward the feed warehouse, with that particular quality of movement that is not quite hurrying, but is also not quite not hurrying. Silas saw him coming. He had time to straighten up, to set himself, to get his chin up, and his hands ready. He had time to say something she didn't catch what from this distance, but something with a grin behind it. Colton hit him once, clean, without any of the surrounding conversation that usually precedes that kind of thing, without announcement or display. Just the single blow, efficient, and Silas went down in the snow in front of the feed warehouse, in front of every man standing there. The laughter had stopped. Colton stood over him for a moment. He said something too quiet for her to hear from the wagon, but she saw Silas's face from where she sat, saw the particular expression that moved across it. Not pain exactly, but something below pain, something that went down further. Then Colton turned and walked back to the wagon and climbed up and took the reins, and the team started moving. They drove the first quarter-mile out of town in silence. Then Evelyn said, "I told you not to." "You did," he said. "He'll use that," she said. "He'll make that into something." "I know," he said. His voice was even. She looked at his hands on the reins, and they were steady, the knuckles not even particularly white, which meant either he was very calm or very controlled, and she wasn't yet sure which was more true of him. "I know he will, then why?" He drove for a moment. The road climbed. The trees thickened on either side. He said, "Because some things need to be said in a language people can hear." She looked at him. She thought about arguing with that. She thought about the men at the feed warehouse, the laughter that had stopped, the particular silence that followed Silas going down in the snow. She thought about whether it was right and whether it was useful, and whether those were always the same question. She decided somewhere on that mountain road, that they weren't always the same question, and she decided that she could hold both things, that he'd done something that would have consequences, and that she wasn't entirely sorry he'd done it without having to resolve them into one. He won't forget it, she said finally. No, Colton said. He won't. The horses pulled steadily uphill, their breath coming visible in the cold air. The ranch was still an hour away. He said something to you in the store, Colton said. Not a question. He was Silas, she said. He doesn't need to say anything specific. The specific is just decoration. Colton was quiet. Then I should have gone in with you. I didn't need you to go in with me, she said. No, he said, but I should have anyway, not because you needed it. He paused. Because it wasn't right, you going in there alone for the first time. She sat with that. Outside the wagon, the mountain closed around them. Familiar now, in a way it hadn't been 2 months ago. She knew these trees by now, knew where the road bent before it bent, knew the point where you could see the roof of the barn through the gap in the pines. Thank you, she said, for what you said, even if it's going to cause problems. It was already going to cause problems, he said. Silas decided that in January. She thought of his face in the store doorway. The slow survey, the 2 seconds before he moved. Yes, she said. He did. They pulled up to the barn in the gray late afternoon light, and she climbed down and began unhitching her side of the team, and he did the same on his side, and the horses moved into their stalls with the easy familiarity of animals that know where home is. She fed them their evening measure. She checked water. She went through her rounds the way she did every evening now, methodical, knowing without having to think about it which animal needed what. When she came back to the house, the fire was already going. Colton must have come in before she finished, and there was water on for coffee and cold meat on the counter that needed cooking. She put the meat on. She listened to the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up, coming down from the north the way it did in March, carrying the last hard cold of the season. The evening felt ordinary. That was the surprising thing. After everything that had happened in town, after Silas in the doorway, and the laughter and Colton's single clean blow, after all of it, she was standing at a stove cooking supper, and the evening felt ordinary. Her knee had held all day. The horses were settled. There was food, and there was warmth, and there was someone else in the next room. And none of those things were small things, even if they had started to feel like they were. She didn't know what Silas Vane was planning. She knew he was planning something men like him always were. The blow in the snow had not resolved anything. It had declared something, and declarations had consequences. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight she plated the meat and called out that supper was ready. And Colton came in from the main room and sat down, and she sat across from him, and they ate, and the wind moved around the house outside, and the fire held. Silas Vane did not come back immediately. That was the thing about him. He was patient in the way that certain kinds of damage are patient, working quietly below the surface while everything above looks unchanged. March became April. The snow on the lower slopes retreated, and the mud season arrived, which was its own particular misery, the ranch road becoming a churned mess that sucked at boots and wagon wheels with equal enthusiasm, the barnyard a negotiation between solid ground and soft. Evelyn learned to read the mud the way she had learned to read the horses, figuring out which patches would hold and which would give, mapping a mental route through it every morning that was slightly different from the morning before. April also brought the first real signs of what the ranch could be in a season other than survival. Colton's breeding mares came into condition, and the work shifted from purely defensive, keeping things alive, keeping things warm, keeping things from falling apart, to something more forward-looking. Buyers had been contacted over the winter. 3 men from different spreads were expected in May to look at the horses. Evelyn had been handling the mare's conditioning work since February, and Colton had said, without making it into more than it was, that she should be the one to present them. She took that seriously. She worked the mares in the lower pasture every afternoon, once the ground firmed enough, learning their individual gaits, their particular resistances, which one moved better after a slow warm-up, and which one needed a sharper start to find her rhythm. She kept notes in a small book she found in the kitchen drawer, the same book Colton had been using for supply lists, writing in the margins and between the lines, because paper was not something to waste. She felt, during those afternoon sessions in the pale spring light, something she hadn't felt in a long time, the specific satisfaction of being good at something that mattered. It was on one of those afternoons, near the end of April, that she smelled the smoke. She had the gray mare on a long line in the lower pasture, working her through a turn pattern, when the smell reached her. It came from the north, not the immediate north, not the barn, but further, from the direction of the upper property where the big barn stood at the edge of the tree line, the one that held the winter feed stores and the equipment Colton had been slowly accumulating for 6 years. The second piece of information was the color of the sky above the tree line, which had a yellow quality to it that wasn't weather. She brought the mare in fast. got her to the fence, looped the line and ran. She was not a fast runner, and she had never pretended to be, but she covered the ground between the lower pasture and the barn with a directness that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with not stopping. She was shouting for Colton before she could see the barn, and she could see the smoke before she finished the first shout, thick and dark, rolling up from the north side of the structure where the hay was stored. Colton was already there. He had been doing fence work on the upper line and had reached the barn perhaps 3 minutes before her, which was 3 minutes of difference that mattered, because he had gotten 4 of the 6 horses out before the north wall fully caught. He was going back in when she arrived. The last 2, he said, and she didn't argue. She went in behind him. The inside of the barn was not yet fully involved. It was still more smoke than flame in the main aisle, the fire running up the north wall where the hay had caught, and the remaining 2 horses were at the far end, not panicking yet but close to it, their eyes showing white and their feet moving constantly in the confined stalls. Evelyn went to the nearer one, a young gelding named Copper, 4 years old, still green enough to be unreliable in a crisis, and she talked to him the whole way down the aisle, steady, low, not loud, and she got her hand on his halter while the smoke thickened above them. She brought Copper out. Colton was right behind her with the last mare, and they cleared the barn door as the north wall made a sound like a long exhale, and the fire found something it liked, and the whole upper portion of that section went. They stood in the yard with the horses pressed against them, Copper's head heavy on Evelyn's shoulder, and they watched the north side of the barn burn. There was nothing to be done about it at this point, no water system close enough, no help to call. Colton had already moved the feed carts clear. The fire would take that section, and they would have to let it. How did it start, she said. It was not quite a question. Colton was looking at the base of the fire, where it had originated. His jaw was the way it got when he was holding something in. There's no lantern stored there, he said. No stove, no lamp, nothing that could generate a spark on its own. She looked at the same spot he was looking at. When did you last check the north end? This morning, he said. Everything was in order this morning. They stood there for another moment. Copper shifted against her, and she put her hand on his neck automatically, steadying him. Silas, she said. Colton didn't answer, which was its own answer. He turned away from the fire and began moving the horses to the lower pasture, and she helped him, and they worked until the animals were settled and the remains of the barn had burned down to something manageable, and neither of them said Silas Vane's name again that night. But the name was in everything anyway, in every silence between them, in the smell of the smoke that stayed in their clothes long past the fire itself. The foreclosure notice arrived 4 days later. A man Evelyn didn't recognize brought it to the door on a Tuesday morning while Colton was out on the property. She took the paper from him, and he didn't meet her eyes when he handed it over, which was a thing she noted. The paper was official-looking county seal, proper formatting, the kind of document that had been prepared by someone who knew how documents were supposed to look. She read it twice. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and read it a 3rd time. The basis of the notice was a debt claim, a loan allegedly made to Colton Rourke 3 years prior by a lending institution in the county seat, a debt that was allegedly overdue by 14 months, with penalties and interest bringing the total to an amount that would require the property as collateral. The document cited the loan agreement, dated and signed. It cited the terms of the county charter's property seizure provision. It cited a court filing date 6 weeks out. Colton had never mentioned any loan. She set the paper flat on the table and looked at it the way you look at something that is trying to appear like one thing while being another. Then she went out to find him. He was at the south fence, and she walked the distance without slowing, and when she handed him the paper and watched him read it, she watched his face go from concentration to something colder and more specific. I never took this loan, he said. I didn't think so, she said. This signature, he stopped. He looked at the bottom of the document, where the signature was. That's not my signature. It's close. Someone spent time on it. But that's not how I write my name. Can you prove that? I have 7 years of letters, receipts, contracts, all signed. I can prove it. He looked up from the paper. His eyes had that pressured quality she had seen before. But underneath it there was something else, a kind of furious clarity. The look of a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed and finds the confirmation worse than the suspicion was. This is the foreclosure. This is what the barn was for. Create chaos. Get me spending time and money on repairs. Then drop this while I'm already off balance. He didn't expect me to be here, Evelyn said. Colton looked at her. When he planned this, she said, I wasn't part of the calculation. He thought you'd be alone. One man managing a fire and a foreclosure simultaneously that's designed to overwhelm one person. She looked at the document in his hands. He doesn't know you have someone who can work the other problem while you work the first one. He was quiet for a moment. You're saying we split the response. I'm saying we don't give him the reaction he built this for, she said. He wants you burning down to town in a fury to contest this, making noise, looking unstable. Meanwhile, the barn repairs don't get done, and the horses aren't ready for the buyers in 2 weeks. She looked at the paper. You stay here, manage the ranch. Get the horses ready. I'll go to town and find out who else he's done this to. Colton looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, the same one he got sometimes when she said something that landed in an unexpected place. You'll need someone to talk to, he said. Someone who knows the county filing history. Someone who won't report back to Silas. Do you trust the lawyer in town, Hendricks? Hendricks is neutral, he said. He's not brave, but he's honest, which is its own kind of useful. Then I'll start with Hendricks, she said. She went to Jasper Hollow the next morning alone. Colton had offered to come. She had said no, because 2 people arriving together made a statement, and she didn't want a statement yet, she wanted information. And information came more easily when you weren't announcing yourself. Mara Fletcher was the first person she found who was willing to talk. Evelyn hadn't known Mara before the auction. She was newer to Jasper Hollow, had come with her husband 3 years back to run the millinery, and her husband had died of fever last autumn, leaving her the shop and a set of debts she was still negotiating. Evelyn found her in the back of the millinery, working on a hat frame, and introduced herself directly. Mara looked at her for a long moment before saying anything. She was a small woman, sharp-featured, with the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly, because the cost of misjudging them was high. I know who you are, Mara said. I was at the auction. I know, Evelyn said. I remember your face. You weren't laughing. Mara set down the hat frame. What do you want? I want to know if Silas Vane has moved against you, Evelyn said. A debt claim, a notice, anything official looking that appeared after you wouldn't cooperate with something he wanted. The silence that followed had a weight to it. Mara looked at the workbench, then back at Evelyn. He wanted the building, she said, this building. He made me an offer 6 months ago low, insultingly low, but he called it fair. I said no. 3 months later, I got a notice from the county saying my business license had a filing irregularity and I owed back fees going back to when my husband first registered it. She paused. The irregularity didn't exist. I have the original filing. But the notice was official. I paid the fees because I couldn't afford the fight. Did you keep the notice? Evelyn said. I keep everything, Mara said. My husband taught me that. He said documentation is the only thing that stands between a woman and whatever story someone else wants to tell about her. She looked at Evelyn steadily. You're building a case. I'm trying to understand the pattern, Evelyn said. A case requires more than 2 points. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said Samuel Price, the farrier on the north end of town, and Ethan Green, he runs freight out of the valley. Or he did before Silas made it impossible for him to keep the contract. She paused. And Jonah Chen. He was going to open a competing mill operation last year. Silas moved against him 3 different ways inside of 2 months. Jonah's still here, but he's not operating. Evelyn wrote the names in her small book. She looked up. Will you talk to them? Will you tell them I'm coming? I'll tell them, Mara said. I won't promise they'll talk to you. Some of them are scared past the point of doing anything about it. I know, Evelyn said, but some of them aren't. Hendricks, the lawyer, was in his office above the hardware store. A small man who wore his suits like he'd borrowed them from someone slightly larger and hadn't gotten around to returning them. He listened to Evelyn's account of the foreclosure notice, with his hands folded on his desk, and his expression arranged into the particular careful neutrality of a man trying to hear information without committing to anything by receiving it. When she finished, he said, The loan documentation, the signature, do you have a comparison ready? Colton's authentic signature against the one on the notice? I can have it by end of week, she said. That's the foundation, he said. A forged signature on a lending document is fraud. County charter fraud. That's federal territory if the numbers are right. He tapped his desk once, then seemed to notice the habit and stopped. The question is witnesses. A forged signature is one person's word against another's, without a witness to the forgery or the absence of the original transaction. What if there's a pattern, she said. What if this isn't the only falsified document he's produced? Hendricks looked at her carefully. How many are you talking about? I don't know yet, she said. At least 3 others I know of. Possibly more. A pattern of falsified official documents across multiple victims changes the character of the complaint significantly, he said. That's not a dispute between 2 parties about a debt. That's systematic fraud against county residents. A judge would be obligated to look at that differently than a single contested notice. What would it take to bring that to a judge, she said. Sworn statements, he said. Each victim in writing attested. The original documents were available, and someone willing to present it who has standing to appear. He looked at her. Colton Rourke has standing. As the most recent target with the largest claim at stake, he'd have grounds to bring a petition. Would you file it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him working through something behind that careful expression, not dishonesty, she thought, but the arithmetic of risk, the calculation a man makes when deciding how much trouble he's willing to step into. If the statements are solid, he said finally, and if you understand that filing this will provoke a response. We're already getting the response, she said. The barn burned last week. Hendricks looked at her for a moment with something that might have been respect, or might have been concern, or was possibly both at once. I'll prepare the framework, he said. Get me the statements. Samuel Price, the farrier, was a large man with hands that looked like they'd been carved from old wood, and a manner that was direct without being warm. He listened to Evelyn in his shop doorway, arms folded, eyes on her face the whole time she talked. When she finished, he said, Silas called in a county inspection on my forge last November. Said there were safety violations, there were no violations. I've been running this forge for 11 years without a single incident. He unfolded his arms. The inspector, a man I'd never seen before, cited me for 3 things. 2 of them were things that didn't exist, and one of them was a technicality about the chimney draft that was borderline at most. Cost me $200 in modifications and a month of downtime during the winter when I couldn't afford either one. Will you put that in writing, Evelyn said. Sworn, dated, signed. What's it going to do, he said. Not hostile, just asking. It's going to make it harder for one judge to look the other way, she said. By itself, no. Combined with others, yes. He was quiet for a moment. And if Silas finds out I signed something, he'll find out, she said. I won't lie to you about that. He always finds out. Samuel looked past her at the street for a moment, working his jaw slightly the way a man does when he's chewing on a decision. My father lost his business to a man like Silas, he said. Different town, same type. Nobody stood up because everyone was waiting for everyone else to go first. He looked back at her. I'll sign. Ethan Green, the freight operator, was harder. He met her at the edge of his property, not inside. At the edge, which told her something, and he was polite and very still in the way people get when they're scared in a direction they haven't fully admitted to themselves yet. Silas had moved his freight contracts to a competitor 8 months ago, citing performance irregularities that Ethan said flatly were invented. And without those contracts, Ethan was operating at 1/3 of his previous capacity. He had a wife and 3 children and a mortgage on the property that the reduced income was barely covering. I want to help you, he said. I do. But if this goes wrong, if Silas hears my name on anything, before you have enough to stop him, he'll pull the rest of my contracts and I'll lose the house. I understand, she said. I'm not asking you to go first. I'm asking you to be part of something that's already going. By the time your name is on a document, there will be other names there ahead of it. He looked at her with an expression. She recognized the expression of someone who wants to believe that the right decision and the safe decision are the same decision, and who is slowly becoming unable to keep pretending that they are. Come back to me when you have the others, he said. When there are enough that Silas can't pick us off one at a time. I will, she said. Jonah Chen's situation was different from the others in a way that took her a moment to understand when she found him at his idle mill operation on the west edge of town. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s, methodical in his movements, with a precise way of speaking that suggested he had started keeping his thoughts in order as a survival measure. He had known from the beginning what Silas was doing to him. He had documented it as it was happening, every threat, every interference, every manipulated contract that disappeared, written down in dated entries in a ledger that he produced from beneath the floor of his office without any prompting, as if he had been waiting for someone to come and ask. I thought about going to the sheriff, he said, but the sheriff and Silas have an understanding. What kind of understanding? Evelyn said. The kind that is worth approximately $200 a quarter, based on what I've been able to observe, Jonah said. She looked at the ledger he'd placed in her hands. It was thorough. Dates, descriptions, names where he had them, dollar amounts where those were available. It was the kind of record kept by someone who grew up understanding that paper evidence was the only kind that couldn't be talked away. This is good, she said. This is very good. It doesn't help if nobody reads it in a context where it means something, he said. It will be read in exactly that context, she said. I promise you that. He looked at her steadily. People make promises, he said. Silas has made promises too. Promises that he would leave us alone if we complied. Promises that the arrangements were temporary. He paused. Why should I believe yours? It was a fair question, and she knew it was fair, and she didn't try to argue around it. Because I'm not offering you safety in exchange for compliance, she said. I'm offering you a fight that might work. Those are different things. I can't guarantee the outcome. I can tell you what I'm doing and what I need and what the realistic chance is, and you can decide. She set the ledger on his desk. That's all I have. No better promises than that. He looked at the ledger, then at her. What do you need from me, he said. She went back up the mountain with names, with partial documents, with 2 signatures already secured, and 2 more that were close. She also went back with something that had happened in the last hour of her time in town, something she hadn't looked for and didn't quite know what to do with yet. On her way out of Jasper Hollow, riding back through the main street, she had passed close enough to the sheriff's office to see through the window. The sheriff, a man named Briggs, who she knew slightly from her years living in town, a man who had always struck her as less corrupt than lazy, which was its own kind of corruption, was seated at his desk. Seated across from him with his back to the window, but recognizable anyway by the set of his shoulders and the particular tilt of his head, was Silas Vane. She hadn't stopped. She had kept riding, kept her pace even, and turned north onto the mountain road without looking back. But she had registered it with the same cold clarity she had registered everything in the past weeks, each piece of information going into its place in the picture she was building, one fact at a time. Silas was meeting with Briggs now. After the barn fire and the foreclosure notice, it meant he was coordinating. It meant the sheriff was not going to be the answer to anything, not a resource, not a neutral party, barely even an obstacle. It meant that whatever response was coming would have to go around Briggs, above him, past him to something he didn't control. It meant Hendricks was right that this needed to be a federal matter, or at least a county seat matter, somewhere outside Silas's particular circle of influence. She came up the mountain in the late afternoon, with all of this organized in her head, and she found Colton in the barn, where he had been working on the structural damage from the fire, not rebuilding yet, just assessing, making the detailed accounting of what could be salvaged and what was gone. He had soot still on his forearms when he came out to take the horse. She told him what she'd found. All of it: Mara, Samuel, Ethan, Jonah, the ledger, Hendricks, and Silas at the sheriff's window. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the reliable things about him that she had come to count on. When she finished, he said, "We have maybe 3 weeks before the court filing date on the foreclosure notice." "I know," she said. "That's not a lot of time to build something that can go over Briggs's head." "It's enough if we don't waste it," she said. He looked at her. The light was going in the west, that long spring light that made things look more solid than they were. The second fire could come any time, he said. The barn was a warning. He'll escalate. "I know that too," she said. She looked at the tree line to the north, where the upper part of the property ran into the national forest, the pine and fir dense enough that a man could move through it unseen if he knew what he was doing. She had been thinking about that tree line since the barn fire, thinking about what it represented, both the vulnerability and something else, something that was perhaps also an opportunity if it came down to it. "We need to tell the others," she said. "Samuel, Ethan, Jonah, Mara. We need them to know what's coming so it doesn't catch them isolated." She looked back at Colton. Silas has been able to move against people one at a time because nobody knew the others were being targeted. If we connect them, if everyone knows everyone else is in this, it changes the math. "He won't like that," Colton said. "He won't like a lot of what's about to happen," she said. The fire came on the second night after she got back. Not the barn this time. The barn was already damaged, already being watched. This time it was the northern forest line, a long stretch of dry brush at the edge of the tree line on the upper property, set at 3 points simultaneously in a way that no natural fire starts, the kind of pattern that requires intention and preparation, and more than one person. Colton saw it first from the loft window at just past midnight, and he was shouting before he was fully dressed, and Evelyn was out the door 30 seconds after him, and they worked the next 2 hours in the dark with wet burlap and the water the horses didn't need, beating back the edge of the burn where it was trying to find its way into the standing timber. They stopped it. Not cleanly. There was a stretch of perhaps 40 yards of scorched brush that would take a season to recover, but they stopped it from reaching the trees, which was the thing that mattered, because if it had reached the timber, it would have run for miles in the dry spring conditions, and there would have been nothing to stop it. They stood in the dark afterward with the smell of char on everything, looking at the stopped edge of the burn, and Evelyn's arms were shaking with the effort of the past 2 hours, but her hands were steady on the wet burlap she was still holding. 3 points, she said. He had 3 men out here. At least, Colton said. She turned to look at the tree line, where the men would have come from, the darkness between the trees that had hid them, and then taken them back. She thought of Silas at the sheriff's window. She thought of Jonah's ledger, sitting in her bag in the house. She thought of Ethan Green's face come back when there are enough that he can't pick us off one at a time. "I need to go back to town tomorrow," she said. "I need Ethan's signature now, not when there are enough now." Colton looked at her. He said he needed more time. "He doesn't have more time," she said. "None of us do. The longer we wait for conditions to be safe enough, the more Silas does to make sure they never are." She turned to him fully, her face probably unreadable in the dark, the burn smell still in the air around them. "He's betting on our fear being bigger than our anger. He's been betting on that with everyone he's done this to." Colton was quiet for a moment. The horses, unsettled by the smoke, were moving restlessly in the lower pasture. He would need to check them before they went back inside. "You've changed," he said. It wasn't a criticism. It was an observation delivered in the same careful way he delivered most things, as information rather than judgment. She thought about that. She thought about the courthouse steps in January, the cold in the boards, Silas Vane's grin and his $20. She thought about everything between that moment and this one, the boots and the stew and the horses and the fence work and the March mud and Dulcie's colic and the hard specific education of learning what her body could do when she asked it to do something that mattered. "I was always this," she said. "I just needed somewhere to be it." He looked at her for another moment in the dark. Then he went to check the horses, and she went to put out the last of the smoldering edges, and neither of them said anything more about it, because there was work still to do, and the night was not finished with them yet. By the time the first gray light came up in the east, the burn was cold. The house was intact. The horses were settled. And Evelyn had the outline of the petition in her head, who would sign it, in what order, how it would be presented, what it needed to say to be heard by someone who existed outside Silas Vane's considerable reach. She went inside and put the coffee on and sat at the kitchen table with Jonah Chen's ledger open in front of her, and she began to write. The petition took 11 days to build into something Hendricks said he could file without embarrassment. Evelyn went back to town 4 times in those 11 days, each trip a different calculation of who to approach and in what order and with what already in hand when she arrived. She had learned, in the months on the mountain, a version of patience she hadn't possessed before, not the passive patience of waiting for things to improve, but the active kind, the kind that knows when pushing harder produces less than waiting one more day. She applied that to the petition, the way she applied it to the horses, reading the resistance and working with it rather than against it. Ethan Green signed on the second visit, as she'd said he would. She had come back to him not with reassurances, but with Jonah's ledger, and Samuel's signed statement, and Mara's account laid out on his kitchen table while his wife stood in the doorway listening. His wife's name was Clara, and Clara had not said a word the entire time Evelyn talked. But when Evelyn finished, Clara had looked at Ethan and said, quietly, and without any particular drama, that she thought it was time. Ethan had signed. 2 more names came through Mara's connections, a woman named Ruth Aldgate, who had lost a supply contract under circumstances similar to Ethan's, and a man named Prescott, who had been pressured out of a mining claim on the Upper Ridge 2 years ago by what he described as a combination of legal threats he couldn't afford to contest and physical intimidation he couldn't prove. Prescott had been drinking his way through the aftermath for 18 months, and he was not an ideal witness. But his claim was documented in county records, and the timing was consistent with the pattern, and Hendricks said a flawed witness was still a witness as long as the documentary evidence was solid around him. 17 sworn statements in the end, Jonah's ledger. Colton's comparison signatures, 7 years of authentic documents set against the forged loan agreement, so clearly different in the hand that Hendricks had looked at them side by side and said, with the closest thing to feeling Evelyn had seen from him, "This is contemptible." The petition went to the county seat on a Friday morning, carried by Hendricks himself, because Evelyn had decided that Hendricks arriving in person would signal a seriousness that mailed documents would not. She had argued this with him for 20 minutes until he agreed, and he had taken the morning stage, looking like a man going to his own trial, rather than someone else's, which she supposed was honest enough. The court filing on the fraudulent foreclosure was suspended pending review. They received word of that on a Tuesday, 9 days after the petition went in. The judge assigned to review the case was not a local man, he was from the circuit, someone who rotated through the county on a quarterly basis and owed nothing to Jasper Hollow's existing arrangements. That mattered more than any single piece of evidence. Evelyn read the suspension notice at the kitchen table and set it down, and sat very still for a moment. Colton was watching her from across the table. "Good news should look better than that," he said. "It's not over," she said. "This stops the foreclosure from proceeding while the fraud claim is reviewed. Doesn't arrest anyone. It doesn't close Silas's operation. It doesn't undo anything he's done." She looked at the notice. "It's 1 door closing." "He has other doors. He'll know it was us," Colton said. "He already knows," she said. "He's known for weeks. He's been watching what we were doing and deciding whether it would amount to anything." She looked up. "Now he knows it amounts to something." Colton picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "Then we watch the property," he said, carefully. "Yes," she said, "we do." The watching was its own kind of exhausting. May settled over the Clearwater Fork with real warmth. For the first time, the snow retreating to the high peaks, the pastures greening, the horses shedding their winter coats in uneven patches that required daily attention with a curry comb. The horse buyers came as scheduled, 3 men from different spreads, and Evelyn presented the mares as Colton had asked her to. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything now thoroughly, without illusion about the gaps in her preparation, filling those gaps as best she could before the day arrived. The buyers were all experienced horsemen, which meant they were not easily impressed and not particularly interested in anything beyond the animals themselves. She walked them through each mare's attributes, her conditioning work, her gait patterns, the particular strengths, and any areas that needed more development. She spoke plainly, without the salesman's habit of overclaiming. When one buyer asked a question she didn't have a confident answer to, she said so, and told him what she did know instead. 2 of the 3 buyers made offers. One of those offers was accepted on the spot, a sale price that Colton later said was 20% above what he'd gotten for comparable horses the previous year. Evelyn did not make a production of that. She filed it away in the category of things that were good and moved on to the next thing. But she had noticed, without meaning to, the expression on Colton's face when the buyer shook her hand, instead of his at the conclusion of the sale. Not resentment, it wasn't that. And she had been watching closely enough to be certain. Something quieter. A kind of settling. Like a thing that has been uncertain for a while, resolving itself in a direction it had been moving toward all along. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. They had developed over the months a fluency in not saying things that didn't need saying, which was its own kind of closeness, the negative space of a partnership, the things you trusted each other to understand without the tax of making them explicit. The months that followed the petition were not peaceful, but they were quieter than before. Silas did not fire another barn or set another tree line alight, which Evelyn attributed partly to the petition having put him under a quality of scrutiny he preferred to avoid, and partly to a calculation she believed he was making a larger move, something designed to end it comprehensively rather than in pieces. He was a patient man. She had known that from the beginning. Patient men didn't abandon what they wanted, they waited for better conditions. She spent the summer building other things in the meantime. The connection between the people who had signed the petition did not end when the signatures were gathered. It had created something, a channel of communication and mutual awareness that hadn't existed before. Mara had started hosting what she called practical meetings, which was a careful way of saying that people who Silas had moved against were gathering to share information, but calling it practical made it sound like bookkeeping rather than organizing, which was useful for keeping Silas from treating it as a provocation. Evelyn went to those meetings when she could. She was not the leader of them. Mara had a natural authority in that room that came from being trusted by everyone in it, and Evelyn understood enough about how those dynamics worked to know that inserting herself at the center of something that was functioning well would be counterproductive. She contributed where she had specific knowledge. She listened the rest of the time, Samuel Price said, at one of the August meetings, that he'd heard through a contact in the county seat that the circuit judge's review of the fraud claim was proceeding and that Silas had hired legal representation from outside the county, which was the kind of expense that indicated he was taking the matter seriously. That was useful information. It meant the petition had weight. It also meant Silas had resources Evelyn's group did not, and legal battles between unequal resources had a history that did not favor the side with fewer dollars. He'll try to settle, Jonah said at the same meeting. That's what I would do in his position. Offer just enough to make the complaint go away without admitting anything. And if people take the settlement, Mara said, then the pattern disappears, Evelyn said. Each individual complaint settles separately. Nothing goes on record. He pays out what amounts to a cost of doing business and goes back to doing business. She looked at the group, which means we don't settle, not individually. If he wants to offer something, he offers it to everyone simultaneously, in a public forum, on record. Ethan Green shifted in his seat. That's easy to say when it's not your mortgage, he said, not unkindly. Some of us can't afford to be principled indefinitely. I know, she said. And I won't ask anyone to hold longer than they can. She looked at him directly. But if we can hold until the circuit review concludes a few more months, then the record exists regardless of what anyone settles for afterward. The pattern is established. That protects anyone who comes after us. The room was quiet. Outside the millinery window, the August evening light was gold and long, and Jasper Hollow's Main Street moved through its ordinary business, and you could almost forget, looking out that window, that the ordinary business had been arranged by one man's appetite for more than he needed. A few more months, Samuel said finally to the room in general, and there was something in the way he said it that was agreement without being formal agreement, which was the way most important things got decided in rooms like that one. The cold came back in October, and with it the particular mood of a place settling in for another season of endurance. Evelyn had been on the Clearwater Fork Ranch for 9 months. She knew it differently now than she had in January, not just its geography but its character. the way it held weather, the way certain repairs kept coming back no matter how well you did them, the specific way the northeast wind came off the high ridge and hit the barn's east wall in a way that had been slowly loosened the siding since before Colton built the place. She had her own rhythms here now. Her own systems developed alongside Colton's without displacing them, a parallel set of habits that had wound around his, the way a second plant winds around an established one, not choking it, just finding the available light. She knew where everything was. She knew what needed doing before the day told her. She knew the horses by mood as well as by name, knew which one was likely to be difficult on a cold morning and which one would be steady regardless. She also knew Colton Rourke considerably better than she had in January, which was a thing she had stopped pretending was simple or uncomplicated. She knew he slept badly during lightning storms, not that he ever said so, but he was always up before her on those mornings, the coffee already made, with the specific quiet of someone who has been awake for hours rather than minutes. She knew he read in the evenings, when the work was done, sitting near the lamp with a book he held in a way that suggested he had read it before and was returning to something familiar rather than encountering it new. She knew he had a temper under the controlled surface. She had seen it twice, both times in situations involving something being done unjustly to something or someone that couldn't defend itself, and both times it had been cold rather than hot, which was its own kind of intensity. She knew he had been watching her, not in the way Silas watched things, cataloging, calculating, filing for future use. In the way someone watches something they have developed a feeling about and are not entirely sure what to do with the feeling. She had her own feeling and was not entirely sure what to do with it either, so they were even on that count. It was in October on an evening when the first real cold of the new season had come down from the peaks, and the fire in the main room was the most important thing in the house, that Colton said, without preamble, without anything that led up to it, "I don't want you to think you're here because of an obligation." She was mending a piece of harness at the table. She did not look up immediately. "I don't think that," she said. "You've paid back more than I put out," he said. "In any accounting, that makes sense. I want that to be clear." She set down the harness and looked at him. He was sitting in the chair near the lamp, his book closed in his lap, looking at her with the careful directness he used when he was saying something that had been waiting to be said for a while. "It's clear," she said. "Good," he said, and picked up his book, and she picked up the harness, and the fire made its sound. A minute passed. "Colton," she said. He looked up. "I know," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted, not open exactly. He didn't work that way, but less closed than usual, as if a door that had been latched from the inside had moved slightly on its hinges. "All right," he said. She went back to the harness. He went back to his book. Outside, the wind moved around the house and the fire held, and neither of them said anything more that evening, and neither of them needed to. Silas Vane came in November. Not through lawyers, not through falsified documents, not through men in the dark with fire. He came in daylight on a Thursday morning when the sky was the flat white of snow coming, riding at the front of 7 horses. Himself and 6 men behind him, 3 of whom Evelyn recognized as his regular lumber foremen, and 3 she had not seen before, bigger men, with a particular quality of stillness that was not calm but readiness. She saw them from the barn window while she was working. She had enough time to get to the house and call up to Colton in the loft before they reached the property gate. Colton was down the ladder and had his rifle before she finished her second sentence. He looked out the front window. 6, he said. "I counted 7, including Silas," she said. He looked at her. She had already taken the other rifle from the rack, the one she had been practicing with since February, the one she could now shoot with enough reliability to matter. He looked at it in her hands and then at her face. "You don't have to be outside for this," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to be anyway." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he opened the front door and they went out onto the porch together. Silas had dismounted at the gate. His 6 men remained on horseback, arranged in a loose arc behind him, and the arrangement was designed to be read a certain way, not an arrival, a siege in miniature. He walked toward the porch with his hands at his sides, unhurried, as if he were paying a neighborly call. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He looked at Colton, then at Evelyn, and then briefly, pointedly at the rifle in her hands. Something moved across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement. "Rourke," he said. Then as an afterthought shaped like a dismissal, "Mrs. Hart, what do you want, Silas?" Colton said. His voice was flat. No heat, no courtesy. Silas looked around the property with the appraising sweep of a man taking inventory. His gaze moved across the rebuilt north section of the barn, the pasture fences, the house itself, the yard between. "I want to be reasonable," he said. "I always want to be reasonable. I don't think that's been appreciated." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, which he held out toward Colton. $3,000, bank draft valid, drawn on a sound institution. In exchange for the deed to this property, signed over clean, and you two are free to go wherever suits you. Colton didn't reach for the envelope. $3,000, Colton said. For a property worth 12. Worth 12 if the legal situation resolves in your favor, Silas said pleasantly. Worth considerably less if it doesn't, which it won't. He let that sit. I have resources you don't, Rourke, you know that. You can fight this for another year and spend everything you have fighting it, and I will still be standing when you're not, because I have the capacity to outlast you. He paused. Or you take $3,000 and walk away intact. Those are the options. Evelyn had been watching Silas's face while he talked, and she had been watching the 6 men behind him, and she had also been looking, from the corner of her eye, at the road that came down from the north where it bent around the tree line just before the property gate. She had been watching that road for a specific reason because 4 days ago she had sent a letter, and the letter had required a response to arrive, and the response was either going to arrive today or it wasn't going to matter. She stepped forward, off the porch. Not all the way down the steps, she stopped at the top step, which put her level with Colton and slightly elevated above the yard, which was not accidental. "Mr. Vane," she said. Silas looked at her. Pleasant expression shifted slightly, not dropping, just adjusting, the way a man adjusts when a variable he had dismissed becomes relevant. "This isn't your conversation," he said. "It is, actually," she said. "This is my home, my property to protect, same as Colton's. You're making an offer we're both going to reject, and I'd rather you heard that from both of us, so there's no confusion about where we stand." Silas looked at her for a long moment. She has then spent enough time watching his particular way of looking at people to know what was happening in it. The reassessment, the recategorization, the decision about how much she mattered. She held his gaze and kept her hands easy on the rifle and let him finish whatever calculation he was running. "You've become bold," he said. "I remember you standing on courthouse steps without shoes." "I remember it too," she said. "Your first offer was $20. You've moved up to $3,000. She tilted her head slightly. "We're not interested in either number." His jaw tightened. The pleasant quality left his face in the way it leaves the faces of men who use pleasantness as a working tool and find the tool suddenly useless. "Rourke," he said, turning back to Colton, "be smart. This can be done civilly or it can be done the other way. I'd prefer civil, but I'm not fixed on it." One of the 3 unfamiliar men behind him shifted in his saddle. Just a shift, a repositioning, a hand moving from where it had been. But Evelyn had been watching and she saw it, and she brought the rifle up to half position in a single movement, not aimed, not threatening yet, just present, just visible, just clear about what it was. The man's hand stopped moving, Silas saw. He looked at the rifle, then at her face. "Put that down," he said, and his voice had changed entirely, the pleasant surface gone, the thing underneath it showing, which was not anger exactly, but a pressure so long controlled it had become indistinguishable from coldness. "Take your land," Evelyn said, "if you're powerful enough to take it. That's what you came here to say, isn't it? That you have the power to do what you want and we can either cooperate or face the consequence." She met his eyes without looking away. "So take it right now if you can." The silence that followed was the kind that has edges. Silas stood at the foot of the porch steps with his envelope in his hand, and his 6 men behind him, and his 7 years of accumulated power in this valley. And he looked at Evelyn Hart, standing on the top porch step with a rifle and an expression that had nothing apologetic in it, and something shifted in the confrontation, some invisible weight moving from one side to the other. Then the sound came from the north road, horses, multiple, coming at a pace that was not leisurely. Everyone heard it. Silas turned, his men turned, even the horses shifted. Round the bend in the north road came 4 riders, and the man at the front had a badge on his coat that caught the flat November light. He was not a large man, but he sat his horse with the particular authority of someone who has been given jurisdiction and intends to use it. Behind him rode 3 deputies, and behind the deputies, on a separate horse, was a man Evelyn recognized, Hendricks, who had clearly not been on a horse in some time and was managing it with the grim determination of a man who had made a commitment and intended to honor it regardless of personal discomfort. The riders came through the gate and drew up in the yard. The federal marshal, his name was Cowboy. She knew from Hendricks's letter, looked at the configuration of 7 mounted men and 2 people on a porch and the rifle at half position and assessed it with the practiced eye of someone who had arrived at many situations midway through them. "Silas Vane," he said, not a question. Silas had gone very still. "Marshal," he said. The pleasant quality had returned to his voice instantly like a lamp relit. "This is a private matter between—" "I have 17 sworn statements in my saddlebag," Calloway said, "and a warrant signed by the circuit judge 3 days ago. The private matter you're describing is now a federal fraud matter." He looked at the 6 men. "I'd ask your men to keep their hands where I can see them." Nobody moved immediately. The moment had that specific quality of a moment that is deciding what kind of moment it wants to be, the kind where someone does something irreversible, or the kind where nobody does. Silas made the calculation. She watched him make it, watched him count the deputies against his 6 men, watched him factor in the badge and the warrant, and what those things connected to, watched him come to the conclusion that the move he had come here prepared to make had been foreclosed while he was standing in this yard making speeches. He put the envelope back in his coat. "We'll address this through the proper channels," he said to Calloway, which was the sentence of a man retreating in the only direction that didn't look like retreat. "Yes," Calloway said, "you will, starting now." He nodded to one of his deputies who dismounted and walked toward Silas. "Silas Vane, I'm placing you under federal detention pending review of the fraud charges filed in this county." Silas went very still. The deputy was beside him. "You can't," he started. "The warrant covers it," Calloway said. The circuit judge was specific. He looked at Silas with an expression that had no particular feeling in it, just the flat practicality of a man doing a job he had done before. "Your lawyers know how to find me." The 6 men behind Silas had not moved. They were looking at each other and at the deputies and at the badge doing their own arithmetic, and the arithmetic kept coming out the same way. One of the unfamiliar men turned his horse and walked it toward the gate. Then another. The lumber foreman stayed a moment longer loyalty, or something that had been loyalty so long it didn't know how to stop. And then they turned their horses too, and within 2 minutes the yard had only the marshal and his deputies, and Hendricks and Colton and Evelyn and Silas standing very still while the deputies secured his hands. Hendricks dismounted, with some difficulty and without grace, and came to the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at Evelyn. "I told you I'd file it," he said. "You did," she said. "The circuit judge reviewed Jonah Chen's ledger personally," he said. He said it was the most thorough private documentation of systematic fraud he had encountered in 14 years on the bench. He paused. He said it in writing, in the ruling. She looked out at the yard, where Calloway was speaking quietly to the deputy, and Silas was standing, with his hands secured, and his face arranged into the expression of a man who is calculating his next move without yet finding one. She had imagined this moment, or something like it, in various forms over the past months, and the imagined versions had all had something in them that this one didn't. Some kind of dramatic resolution, some feeling of a thing snapping cleanly into place. The real version was quieter, more specific, more like a door closing than a storm breaking. Colton had come to stand beside her at the top step without her noticing him move. She was aware of his shoulder near her shoulder, and the solidity of him there, the fact of him present for this specific moment, after everything the getting to this moment had cost. 17 statements, she said quietly, not to anyone specifically. Just saying the number, feeling the weight of it, 17 people who had been afraid, and then decided not to let the fear be the final answer. 17, Colton said. Below them in the yard, Calloway had finished his conversation and was moving toward his horse. He stopped and looked up at the porch. "Ma'am," he said. He looked at her with the same flat practicality he'd directed at Silas, but with something else in it now, a small specific acknowledgement, the kind you give to someone who has done work that needed doing. The judge is going to want those statements confirmed in circuit court. You and the others who signed will likely need to appear. Hendricks can walk you through the process. We'll be there, she said. He nodded once and mounted his horse. The deputies formed up around Silas, who walked to his horse with his hands secured and his back straight, that much dignity he held on to. That much. And then the group moved out through the gate and onto the north road and became sound, and then became nothing. The yard was empty. The flat white sky pressed down. One of the horses in the far pasture called out once, for no particular reason the way horses do. Evelyn stood on the top porch step and let out a breath she had been holding for a length of time she couldn't accurately measure, possibly since January, possibly since long before that. Her hands had stopped shaking, which she hadn't been aware they were doing until they stopped. Colton's hand came to rest on her shoulder. Not dramatic, not a gesture from a story, just his hand, warm through her coat, present. She put her hand over his briefly, then she said, "We should check the horses. They'll be unsettled from all the commotion." "They will," he said. "And I need to write to Mara and the others," she said. "They need to know." "After the horses," he said. She came down off the step and crossed the yard toward the pasture, and he came with her, and the cold air moved between them and around them, and the flat sky held its snow for now, and the ranch sat in the late morning quiet the way it always did when the work was ongoing, and the work was enough. She was halfway across the yard when she stopped and turned back. Hendricks was still standing near the gate, beside his horse, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before something past the careful neutrality, something that had come loose from it in the last hour's proceedings. "Hendricks," she called. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, for getting on the horse. He looked down at himself, then back at her, and something moved across his face that was unmistakably a smile, quick and real, and a little surprised at itself. "I won't be doing it again anytime soon," he said. "Once was enough," she said, and turned back toward the pasture. The horses came to the fence when they saw her coming. Dulcie first, as usual, the gray mare who had lived through her colic in February, and seemed to have decided that Evelyn was worth greeting specifically. Evelyn put her hand on Dulcie's nose and stood there for a moment, the horse's breath warm against her palm in the cold air. Colton came up beside her and leaned on the fence, and they stood looking at the horses in the way you stand, looking at something that has made it through something difficult, with the particular quiet satisfaction of things still intact. "What happens now?" she said, not anxiously. "Just asking." "Lawyers," he said. "Court dates. Probably a winter of that before anything is settled." He paused. "The ranch keeps running in the meantime." "Yes," she said. "It does." She scratched behind Dulcie's ear. The mare leaned into it. "He had people on his payroll who will scatter," she said. "The sheriff will have a difficult few months. Briggs will cooperate when cooperating is the safer option," Colton said. "Men like him always do." She thought about the other people in Jasper Hollow, not the ones who had signed the petition, but the ones who had stood watching at the auction, the ones who had laughed at the feed warehouse, the ones who had delivered official-looking notices and done the ordinary small work of Silas's operation, while telling themselves they were just doing their jobs. She thought about what happened to those people after the machinery they'd been part of stopped running. Some of them didn't have a choice, she said. Some of them didn't, he agreed. And some of them did. Yes, he said, some of them did. She left that where it was. There was not yet enough distance from today to have a clear accounting of it, and she had learned in the past year that premature clarity about complicated things was its own kind of dishonesty. What she knew was this: the fraud claim was on record. 17 names were on record. Jonah's ledger was in a federal file. The pattern existed in a form that couldn't be privately settled away or paid into silence. Whatever happened next, in courtrooms she had no control over, this part had held. She had done this part. Not alone, she was clear about that, clearer than she had been about most things, but she had driven it. And the driving had required something she hadn't known she possessed, until the Clearwater Fork gave her the conditions to find it. The wind came off the ridge in a long, cold gust, and the horses shifted together along the fence line. She stayed at the fence until she was cold through, and then she went inside to write the letters. The letters went out same afternoon, written at the kitchen table while the light faded and the cold pressed against the windows. Evelyn wrote to Mara first, then to Samuel, then to Jonah, then to Ethan and Clara Green, then to Ruth Aldgate and Prescott, and the others whose names were on the petition. She wrote each letter separately, not copies of a single template. Each person's situation was different enough that a form letter would have been an insult to what they had risked. She told them what had happened. She told them what would likely happen next. She told them what Hendricks had said about the circuit court appearances and what that would require of them. And she told them, plainly and without dressing it up, that the hardest part was probably not behind them yet, but that what had happened today was real and it held. Colton carried the letters to town the next morning before she was up. She heard him leave in the dark, the barn door, the horse, the sound of hooves on the frozen ground going south. She lay in the dark for a while after that, not sleeping but not quite awake either, in that particular suspended state that follows a long sustained effort when the effort has finally paused. The winter came on properly in December. Not as brutal as the one that had begun this whole chain of events, or maybe she was simply better equipped for it now, in every sense, the physical preparation and the mental and the practical. She knew the ranch's cold weather rhythms. She knew her own. She moved through the shortened days with a competence that was no longer effortful, just hers, the way any learned thing eventually becomes part of you without your being able to identify the exact moment it stopped being learned and started being known. The court proceedings began in January, almost exactly 1 year from the auction. She noticed the anniversary without meaning to, on a morning when she was breaking ice in the water trough, and the cold came up through her boots, the good ones, Colton's sister's boots, worn through their newness now into something that fit her exactly, and her mind made the connection without any deliberate invitation. 1 year. 1 year since she had stood on courthouse steps without shoes and been priced at $20 by a man who thought her worth was determined by how little he could pay for it. She stood at the water trough for a moment, letting that land. The horse beside her, Dulcie, always Dulcie at the morning trough, pushed her nose against Evelyn's arm in the impatient way she had developed, which meant the ice was broken and the water was available, and the conversation Evelyn was having with herself needed to conclude. "All right," Evelyn said, and stepped back, and Dulcie drank. The circuit court was in the county seat, 40 miles south of Jasper Hollow, a 2-day trip each way by stage. Evelyn made it 3 times over the course of the winter and spring, twice with Colton and once alone. On the occasion when Colton couldn't leave the ranch during a difficult foaling, and she went in his place to present the additional documentation Hendricks needed confirmed. The courthouse in the county seat was a different world from anything Jasper Hollow had. Larger, more formal, with the accumulated weight of institutional authority in its proportions and its smell-old paper, wax, the particular mustiness of a building, where important things had been happening long enough to soak into the walls. She had been intimidated by it the first time, in a way she wouldn't have admitted to anyone. She had walked in behind Hendricks feeling every inch of the distance between who she was and who the building seemed designed for. By the 3rd visit, she walked in knowing where the relevant offices were and which clerk to speak to and what language to use to get information efficiently. She had learned the place the same way. She learned everything by paying attention and not pretending she already knew things she didn't. Silas's lawyers were good. She had expected that and been right to expect it. They were from a firm in the capital, 2 men who wore their suits like they'd been born in them and spoke in the particular cadence of people who spend most of their time in rooms like this one. They contested every piece of evidence with a professionalism that had to be respected, even as it needed to be countered. They found inconsistencies in 3 of the 17 statements, not fabrications. Genuine inconsistencies in dates and specifics that witnesses had remembered slightly differently in the stress of the moment, and they worked those inconsistencies with the patient skill of men who knew that. Reasonable doubt was a structure built from small gaps, Hendricks held. That surprised her somewhat, because Hendricks in his office above the hardware store had seemed like a cautious man, a man calibrated for the contained risks of small-town legal work. But Hendricks in a courtroom was something different, precise, prepared, with a memory for documentary detail that met Silas's lawyers on their own ground. He had spent the winter building the case the way Evelyn had spent it, building the petition, methodically, filling gaps, anticipating objections. He came to each session with more than he needed and used exactly what was required. The forged signature was the center of it. Hendricks had brought in a document examiner from the capital, an elderly woman named Frances Marsh, who had spent 30 years analyzing handwriting for courts, and who took the stand with the calm authority of someone who has been the most knowledgeable person in most rooms she's ever entered. She laid out the comparison between Silas's loan document and Colton's authentic signatures with the same methodical clarity she would have used explaining it to a student. The pen pressure, the particular slant, the way the R in Rourke was formed, the slight leftward hook that appeared in every authentic sample and was absent in the forgery. Silas's lawyers cross-examined her for 2 hours. She did not alter a single conclusion. The fraud ruling came in April. Not a complete verdict on all counts. The arson charges required a separate proceeding, and the question of the sheriff's involvement was being handled through a parallel investigation that moved on its own slower timeline, but the core fraud charges were sustained. The fraudulent loan document was declared void. The foreclosure notice was formally invalidated. The systematic pattern of false filings against Jasper Hollow residents was entered into the official record of the circuit court, which meant it existed in a form that was public and permanent, and could not be quietly made to go away. Silas Vane was held in federal detention pending the outcome of the additional proceedings. His lawyers filed for bail. The judge denied it, citing the evidence of the fire and the armed confrontation at the ranch as indication of ongoing risk. His lumber operation, without his direct management, began contracting. Key foremen left. Contracts were renegotiated by parties who had previously been too intimidated to push back, and the carefully constructed web of dependencies that had made him powerful in the valley began to show the weakness that had always been underneath it. It had been held together by fear rather than genuine value, and fear is not a durable adhesive once people have discovered they can live without it. Ethan Green got his freight contracts back. Not all of them, but enough. He came to tell Evelyn in person, riding up the mountain on a Thursday in May, with Clara behind him on the horse, and they sat on the porch and drank coffee, and Clara told Evelyn, with a directness that Evelyn respected, that she had been afraid this would cost them everything, and she was glad it hadn't. It almost did, Evelyn said honestly. I know, Clara said. That's why I'm glad. Jonah Chen reopened his mill operation in June quietly, without ceremony, just appeared one morning with lumber and workers and started building. By midsummer, he was operating at half capacity and projected to be at full by fall, and he sent Evelyn a note that said only the ledger did its work. She kept the note in the kitchen drawer with the supply lists and the small book of horse notes. Mara Fletcher expanded the millinery into the adjacent space that Silas had been trying to acquire, because the building next door had been part of his operation, and with his empire contracting, it had become available, at a price Mara had spent 18 months quietly saving toward, without knowing exactly when the opportunity would present itself. She was, Evelyn thought, someone who would have been formidable under any circumstances, but adversity had focused her into something particularly sharp. The sheriff, Briggs, resigned in May, citing health reasons. Nobody in Jasper Hollow discussed the health reasons, because the health reasons were obvious to everyone, and naming them out loud would have required a level of candor the town was not yet ready for. A new man came up from the county seat on an interim basis, a younger man named Ferris who asked good questions and wrote things down, and did not, in the first months of his tenure, appear to have any special financial arrangements with the lumber industry. Progress, Evelyn thought. Uneven, incomplete, slower than it should be, but progress. It was Samuel Price who said it most plainly, at one of Mara's gatherings in July, a different kind of gathering now. Less strategic planning and more the easy company of people who have been through something together and found themselves on the other side of it, still standing. The thing about Silas, Samuel said, is that he wasn't exceptional. That's what's been sitting with me. He looked at his coffee cup. There's one like him in every valley, every county. The particular arrangement was his. The specific targets were his. But the method: find people who are alone, move against them one at a time, make the cost of fighting back bigger than the cost of complying. That's not a new invention. He looked up. What was different here was that someone connected the isolated people. The room was quiet for a moment. That was Evelyn, Marcia said. It was all of us, Evelyn said, because she meant it, and because it was also strategically true. The kind of truth that makes what you've built more durable by distributing the ownership of it. It started with you, Mara said. She said it without argument or flattery, just the plain statement of someone recording what actually happened. You came into town alone on a horse asking questions that nobody had thought to ask out loud yet. Most of us were waiting for someone else to go first. You went first. Evelyn looked at the window, at the summer light on the main street of Jasper Hollow. She thought about what going first had actually felt like, which was not heroic in any sense she would use that word. It had felt like deciding that the alternative was worse, which was a smaller and more honest accounting of bravery than the stories usually gave. I didn't have as much to lose as some of you, she said. That made it easier to start. You had everything to lose, Samuel said. You just didn't let that be the deciding factor. She didn't have an answer for that, so she drank her coffee and let the conversation move on, which it did, to the ordinary things: Ethan's contracts, Jonah's mill, the question of what to do about the former Silas property on the North Ridge that was now sitting in a legal limbo of unpaid debts and contested ownership. Those were tomorrow's problems, but they were good problems, the kind that existed because something had been cleared away, rather than because something was closing in. The proposal came in August, which surprised her, though looking back she could see that it shouldn't have. She had not been expecting it, that particular evening, had not been thinking about it at all. In fact, which was perhaps the most honest thing she could say about where her mind had been in the months since the court ruling. The ranch had expanded its horse operation in the spring. There were more animals to manage, more preparation for the fall buyers, more of the ongoing physical work that the Clearwater Fork demanded in the growing season. She had been full of work and the satisfactions of it, the accumulated daily evidence of being useful and capable and present in a life that was genuinely hers now in a way that January felt like another person's story. They had been outside after dinner, on the south side of the house where the porch caught the last of the evening light. It was the kind of summer evening that the high country produced at its best, the air just cool enough to be comfortable, the light going golden long across the pasture, the horses visible at the far fence as dark shapes against the brightness. Colton had been quiet in that particular way of his that she had learned, meant something was working toward the surface. She had not pushed it. She had sat on the porch steps with her coffee going cold and watched the light change on the pasture and waited for whatever it was to arrive in its own time. He reached into his shirt pocket and held something out to her. A ring. Small, gold, simple, worn smooth with age, the kind of smoothness that comes from being worn for years by hands that worked. She looked at it in his palm. It was my mother's, he said. She gave it to me when I left Wyoming. She said, keep it for something that matters. He paused. I've had it for 6 years. She looked at the ring. Then at him. Colton, she said. I know what I'm asking, he said. And I know it's not a small thing. You built something here that's yours, independent of me. I don't want to. He stopped, started again. I'm not asking you to give up what you've built. I'm asking if you want to build something else alongside with me. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer, she had known the answer for a while. In the way you know things you haven't yet said out loud, but because the moment deserved something more than a reflex, and she wanted to be in it clearly before she answered. She thought about January, the courthouse steps, the cold boards, $20. She thought about the coat he had put around her shoulders without making it a performance. She thought about every morning of the past year and a half, the water trough, the horses, the kitchen, the fence work, the difficult days when nothing went right, and the good days when things did. All of it conducted alongside this man who had never once looked at her body and found it wanting, who had never offered her pity when she needed competence, who had watched her become something in this place and had treated that becoming as inevitable rather than remarkable. She thought about the fact that she was choosing. That was the thing she wanted to hold clearly. This was a choice, not a rescue, not a negotiation of necessity. She was a woman with a working life and a skill and a place she had earned, and she was choosing this man from that position, not from the courthouse steps, not from $20, not from cold boards and bare feet and the humiliation of being assessed and found insufficient. She reached out and took the ring from his palm. "I'm not marrying you because I need to," she said. "I want that to be clear, I know," he said. "And I'm keeping the horse operation," she said. Under my name on the papers, something moved across his face, not offense, not surprise. The thing she had started to recognize as his version of happiness, which was quieter than most people's, but no less real. "Obviously," he said. She put the ring on. It fit not perfectly, slightly loose on the finger, needing adjustment. She looked at it on her hand and thought that slightly loose and needing adjustment was perhaps not the worst description of most things worth keeping. "All right," she said. He put his hand over hers briefly. Then they sat in the last of the evening light and drank their cold coffee and watched the horses in the pasture, and neither of them said much more, because there was not much more that needed saying. They married in October, a year and 10 months after the auction. The ceremony was small, which was what they both wanted, and the people in it were the ones who had been part of everything: Mara, Samuel, Jonah, Ethan, and Clara. Ruth Hendricks, looking more at ease than she had ever seen him outside a courtroom. A few others from the Clearwater Fork country, who had become neighbors in the genuine sense over the past year. Colton's sister came from Wyoming, a tall woman named Margaret who had her brother's eyes, and a directness Evelyn recognized and liked immediately. Margaret had brought the boots back, the ones she'd left on her last visit, saying she'd found better ones, and Evelyn should keep these. And there was a warmth in the gesture that was not about the boots at all. The ceremony itself was simple, conducted by the justice of the peace from the county seat, outdoors in the south pasture because the day was clear and cold, and the mountains were visible above the tree line. For the first time in weeks, the high peaks white against a sky so blue, it looked like something someone had decided on rather than something natural. Dulcie stood at the near fence and watched the proceedings with the calm attention she gave everything, which Evelyn took as approval from the only attendee she had known since February. She had made her own dress. Not from vanity, she was not particularly interested in a beautiful dress for its own sake, but because she wanted to wear something that had been made by her hands, for her body, cut to fit what she actually was rather than what someone else's pattern assumed. She had the material from Mara, good dark wool, and she had spent 3 evenings cutting and fitting and adjusting, and the result was not fancy and was not supposed to be. It was hers. When she walked across the pasture toward the small gathered group, toward Colton, waiting with his hat in his hands, and an expression she had never seen on him before, not the careful, controlled face of a man managing his responses, but something underneath it, something younger and less defended. She walked the way she had been walking for a year and a half now, straight, at her own pace, toward something she had chosen. The justice of the peace read the words. She and Colton said the words back. He put his mother's ring, adjusted now to fit exactly, back on her finger with hands that were steady but not quite, which she noticed and filed away in the category of things she loved about him, without using that word yet in her own head, because she was still getting used to using it. When it was done, Mara cried. Not the apologetic kind of crying, but the forthright kind of a woman who is moved and doesn't see the point of hiding it. Evelyn did not cry, though something in her chest did a thing she couldn't fully describe, a kind of opening, a release of something that had been held carefully for a long time. Samuel shook Colton's hand with the grip of a man who has strong opinions about handshakes and finds this one satisfactory. Jonah bowed slightly to Evelyn in a way that meant more than any formal gesture could explain. Ethan hugged her, which surprised her, and Clara hugged her longer, and Evelyn stood in Clara's embrace and herself beheld for a moment without the instinct to extract herself, which was its own small marker of how far she had come from the woman who had spent years managing the distance between herself and other people's pity. Margaret Rourke stood slightly apart from the group, and when the others dispersed toward the food Mara had organized on the porch table, Margaret came and stood next to Evelyn and looked out at the mountains. He was lonely before, Margaret said. He wouldn't say that. He'd say he was fine, which is what he says about everything that costs him. She glanced at Evelyn. He's not lonely now. Evelyn looked at the mountains. No, she said, neither am I. Margaret nodded once, satisfied, and went to find coffee. The winter of that year was hard but manageable in the way that hard things become manageable when you have the right tools and the right partner and a reasonable understanding of what the difficulty is going to require. The additional horses they'd taken on in spring needed consistent work through the cold months, and Evelyn had developed a winter conditioning program that was her own design, built from what she had read and what she had observed and what the horses themselves had taught her through the months of paying attention to them. She wrote it down, eventually not for publication, just for herself and for whoever came after, because she had learned from Jonah Chen that documentation was not just a legal tool, it was how knowledge survived. The arson trial concluded in February. Silas's connection to the barn fires and the forest burning was established through the testimony of two men who had been in his employ and who, with their employer's empire contracting around them and the federal investigation making loyalty expensive, had found cooperation with the prosecution to be the more sensible arrangement. The evidence was not perfect, it rarely is, but it was sufficient, and Silas was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison at Carson, which was far enough from Jasper Hollow that his physical presence would not complicate the valley's recovery. She heard the news from Hendricks, who sent a letter, and she read it at the kitchen table, and then set it down and sat for a moment with the specific quiet of something concluded. 7 years. She thought about what 7 years meant, about the people who had lost businesses and income and peace of mind in years of their lives to one man's appetites. 7 years in a prison felt like both too much and too little, depending on which direction you were looking from, which was probably the honest way most real justice felt as opposed to the clean narrative version. She sent a letter to each of the petition signers with the news. She did not tell them how to feel about it. She told them it was over in the immediate sense, and that the court record stood, and that what they had done together had mattered, and would continue to matter for people who came after them in that valley. Then she put the letters in the post and went out to work, because the horses needed their morning, and the world outside was cold and bright and asking for her attention. Spring came in the way it always did at the Clearwater Fork, not gradually but in stages, each one abrupt and unmistakable. First the quality of the light changing, then the sound of the creek under the ice, then the ice going, then the mud, then almost suddenly, it seemed, every year the green. Evelyn was in the pasture with the mares on the first genuinely warm morning of April when she stopped what she was doing and just stood for a moment in the sun with her face up and her eyes closed. The warmth on her face was the specific warmth of a season returning rather than just a warm day, and her body knew the difference. She thought about the woman who had stood on courthouse steps in January cold without shoes, being assessed by a crowd of people who had known her whole life. She thought about what that woman had believed about herself, not consciously, not in words she would have said out loud, but in the way she held herself, the particular shape of the space she tried to take up, the automatic apologies for her presence in rooms that would have been better if she were thinner, smaller, easier to dismiss. She thought about how long she had been carrying those apologies without knowing she was carrying them. She thought about Silas's $20 and what it had been designed to say not about her debts but about her, and she thought about the fact that she had let that kind of accounting run in the background of her life for years before Jasper. Hollow, the accumulated weight of other people's assessments of her worth based on the size of her body and the state of her finances, and the absence of anything that looked like conventional advantage. She thought about the courthouse steps, and then she thought about the pasture she was standing in. Her pasture, her horses, her name on the deed alongside Colton's. She thought about the woman in the courtroom who had walked in knowing where the offices were and which clerk to speak to, who had presented evidence in a federal proceeding without apology or permission. The same woman, the exact same woman. Nothing about who she was had changed. What had changed was the distance between who she was and what the circumstances allowed that person to become. That was the thing she had learned, and it was not a simple lesson, and it did not come wrapped in comfort. It was the harder kind of truth, the kind that carries grief alongside it, because if the conditions were what made the difference, then all the years before this had been spent in the wrong conditions, and that was a loss that deserved to be named honestly. The girl who had grown up watching her father lose a farm to a bad loan, the young woman who had married Thomas Hart because fond was more than some people got, the widow standing barefoot in January, those were not lesser versions of her. They were her in circumstances that gave her less room. What she had found on the Clearwater Fork was room, the room to make mistakes and correct them, the room to be bad at things until she was good at them, the room to be large and imperfect and direct and occasionally wrong and still indispensable. Colton had given her some of that room, and she had given herself the rest. And she was honest enough with herself to credit both, without diminishing either. Dulcie came and pushed her nose into Evelyn's shoulder from behind. "I know," Evelyn said. "Work to do." She opened her eyes. The mountains were fully visible above the tree line, the snow still on the high peaks, but the lower country green now, alive. The ranch spread around her in every direction, the barn rebuilt, the fences repaired, the second pasture added in fall, the operation larger and more viable than it had been when she arrived. 2 new foals this spring, 3 more buyers expected in June. The small book of horse notes had been replaced by a proper ledger, her handwriting filling it page by page with the accumulation of what she had learned and was still learning. Colton came out of the barn and crossed the yard toward her, and she watched him come the way you watch someone who has become the familiar geography of your daily life, known, present, part of the landscape. He was carrying a fence tool and had something on his jacket that was probably axle grease, which was, she had come to understand, simply a feature of the man rather than a temporary condition. He would never be a tidy person. She had long since stopped considering this a problem. He stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at, which was the mountains. "The buyers in June," he said. "Henderson's operation from over the ridge is sending a man. They want 6 horses. We have 6 ready," she said. "I told them you'd be the contact," he said. She looked at him. "Your call," he said, "but you know the horses better than I do. You know what each one needs and what each buyer is actually looking for." He said it as a practical statement, not a gesture. That was how he worked. The practical and the meaningful were the same thing, delivered the same way. And she had come to understand that was its own form of respect, more durable than ceremony. "All right," she said. They stood for another moment looking at the mountains. Dulcie had moved off to the water trough, apparently deciding the conversation was not going anywhere interesting. The other mares grazed in the morning light with the particular contentment of animals that are well fed and unafraid. "I was thinking," Colton said. Not leading anywhere, just starting the sentence. "About what?" she said. "The north pasture," he said. "If we clear the east tree line, not all of it, just the scrub growth, we get another ½ acre of usable grazing." Winter capacity was tight this year. She thought about it. The east tree line, the particular growth pattern, what clearing it would mean for drainage. "We'd need to redirect the runoff," she said. "If we take the scrub out, the slope drains differently." "I thought about that," he said. "We'd need to dig a channel along the northern edge before we cleared." "That's fall work," she said, "before the ground freezes." "That's what I figured," he said. They talked through it, standing in the April morning, the way they talked through everything practical, direct, neither of them needing the other to be more than they were. Equal, not in the sense of being identical, but in the sense that mattered, that the voice of each one carried the same weight in any decision that belonged to both of them, that had not been given to her, that had not been negotiated or formally established. It had simply been the shape of what they built together, formed by the daily practice of 2 people who treated each other's capabilities as real. She thought sometimes that this was the thing she would want to tell someone else, if she were ever in a position to tell anyone anything, that equality is not a policy. It is a practice repeated. So many times it becomes the natural condition of the place you're in. The following summer, on a morning in July, when the high country was at its best and the light was the clear, specific light of altitude, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table before the rest of the ranch was awake and wrote a letter to a woman she had heard of through Mara, a woman in the next valley, recently widowed, with debts she couldn't cover, and a community that was showing her what communities show women in that position. She wrote the letter carefully. She did not offer rescue or easy answers. She did not describe her own story as a blueprint, because no story is a blueprint for someone else's life. She wrote what she actually knew, which was this, that the moment you are in the courthouse steps, the bare boards, the $20 is not the measure of you. It is a circumstance. The measure of you is what you do with the room you can find or make. And room can be found in places that don't look like room and made in places that don't seem to allow it. She wrote that it was hard. She wrote that it required more than it was fair to require. She wrote that the hardest part was not the cold or the work or the people who looked at you like you were a problem rather than a person. The hardest part was unlearning the version of yourself that it absorbed. All of that and made it true inside your own mind. She wrote, the price they put on you is not your value. Those are 2 entirely different numbers, and the second one belongs only to you. She signed her name, Evelyn Rourke, née Hart, both names. She had kept both names in her own use, which was not legally conventional, but which was hers, and nobody at the Clearwater Fork Ranch had found it worth arguing about. She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing post, and went out to start the morning work. The horses came to the fence when they saw her. Dulcie first, as always gray and solid and present, the horse who had survived a bad winter and come through it and kept going, which was perhaps not a metaphor for anything in particular, but which Evelyn had always quietly appreciated anyway. She broke the ice in the trough, she filled the feed bins. She moved through her morning with the unhurried competence of someone who knows their work and finds it meaningful. The sun came up over the eastern ridge and the light moved across the pasture, and the mountains went from gray to gold to the particular clear white of snow-capped peaks in full morning. Behind her, the house. The fire Colton had started in the kitchen stove before she came out. She had smelled the smoke as she crossed the yard. Coffee, probably by now. The sound of him moving around in there, the ordinary domestic sound of a shared life being lived in real time, with all its imperfections and its daily negotiations, and its recurring fence repairs and its cold mornings and its horses, with opinions and its moments, sometimes, when the light was right and the work was done, and the people you trusted were near, of something that was not happiness exactly. Happiness was too thin a word for it, but something more solid. Something that had been built rather than found. Something that held. She leaned on the fence for a moment and looked at what was hers, not because it had been given to her, not because a man had purchased a debt and driven a wagon up a mountain and offered a coat and a warm stove, not because she had been lucky, though luck had played its part, the way luck always plays its part in stories that turn out to mean something, because she had stayed, because she had worked, because she had refused, every morning of every difficult month, to let other people's accounting of her worth substitute for her own, because she had gone to Mara Fletcher's door and to Samuel Price's shop doorway, and to Jonah Chen's idle mill and had said, I know this is frightening. I know the cost is real, but here's what is also real, and what is also real is that we are not alone in this. That was the thing, the central thing, the thing underneath all the other things. You can survive alone, but you cannot build alone, not the kind of thing worth building. The ranch was hers and Colton's and could not have been made by either of them separately. The petition was 17 names and could not have stopped one man's machine if it had been 3. The lives rebuilt in Jasper Hollow were built by people who had found each other in the specific and unglamorous way that people find each other not through inspiration or fate, but through someone knocking on a door and asking a question out loud that everyone had been thinking alone. Dulcie pushed her nose into Evelyn's hand. All right, Evelyn said. I hear you. She pushed off the fence and went to start the rest of the morning, and the light continued its slow movement across the mountain country, and the day opened around her like a thing with room enough in it for everything she intended to do.